right, and we're up. Good to go.
Okay, Toys, it looks like you made Harris a co-host.
Did I? Hold on a second. I'm going to make you the host now and pass off. There we go.
All right, great.
You're all set.
Thank you, Toys.
All right, and we're up. Good to go.
Okay, Toys, co-host. Okay, good evening, everyone. It's June 15th, 2020. The time is now 7:03 p.m. I'll start the meeting, as I've started all the meetings, by reading the statement at the beginning of the public notice. In response to the governor's directive to take every effort to keep New Yorkers safe and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, and pursuant to Executive Order 202-1, which allows for the suspension of the public officers law, and the Westchester County Rent Guidelines Board will be conducting public hearings to set guideline rates of rent adjustment for housing accommodations within its jurisdiction, subject to the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, for leases commencing between October 1st, 2020 and September 30th, 2021 via teleconference. Instructions for members of the public to simultaneously view or listen to the meeting will be posted to HCR's website for the Office of Rent Administration under the public hearing section prior to the meetings. This is posted at the moment. The hearings will also later be transcribed, and the public will have the ability to view the transcripts. So Chair Rubin, I will pass it off to you to call the roll.
Good evening. Welcome to this virtual public hearing. This is our third and last public hearing, and I want to welcome everybody and for your participation and your patience in adapting to this new way of conducting the meetings. This is the third, as I said, this is the third and last hearing of the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board to determine guideline rates of rent adjustments for leases commencing or being renewed between October 1st, 2020 and September 30th, 2021. I will now take roll call. Please respond if you're present. Belen Aqua, public member.
Present.
Lamont Badreau, public member.
Present.
Eddie Mae Barnes, public member.
Present.
Elliot Cherson, owner representative.
Present.
Ken Finger, owner representative.
Yeah, I'm here.
Evelyn Santiago, public member.
Here.
Tamara Stewart, tenant representative.
Present.
And Elsa Rubin, public member, present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. And now I will ask Peter if he has any announcements to make, or he wants to just read the next meetings.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow night there's another meeting of the board, which is June 16th. That'll start at 7 o'clock as well. It's for the purpose of the presentations of the tenant and owner representatives. And then the final meeting of the board will take place on June 23rd at 7 o'clock. It'll be for the rebuttal presentations as well as to vote on the rent guidelines. And those meetings can be streamed by the public on the YouTube live stream as well.
Thank you. Before I start calling the people who are going to testify today, I would like to ask the board if they have any announcements or comments to make. Okay, in that case, I will have to just read some of the rules of the meetings. The speakers will be addressing the board during the meeting. and they are limited to 3 minutes for individuals and 5 minutes for persons on behalf of representing entities or any organization. I would like to ask the people who are coming forward to, when I call your name, to please tell me, because I don't have it here in front of me. And please tell the board if you are testifying as an individual or as or on behalf of an entity. And I also want to mention that we have many speakers who signed up for tonight. So we will have to be very strict with the time limit. I will ask Peter to take the timekeeper, and we will give each person 30 seconds before the timing is up. And at that time, we will really appreciate if they can cooperate and finish the presentation. As I said, this time we will be very strict because we have time constraints. And on top of that, we have the new element of having to deal with the technology. So that takes even more time. And I hope that everybody understands, and I hope that everybody cooperates. With that said, I'm going to call Alana Ciufitelli to testify and tell me if you are representing an organization or you are coming as an individual. Is she available, Peter?
Yes, looks like it. I'm promoting her right now.
Hi, I'm here as an individual. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, you will have 3 minutes. And welcome. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. If
Yes.
not, please correct me.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Alana Ciufitelli. I'm a real estate broker, insurance broker, and co-chair of the Apartment Owners Advisory Council, and a board member of the Westchester Owners Association. I also manage several ETPA apartment buildings that my dad built. I'd like to start by saying the last thing I feel like doing tonight is testifying at these hearings. You may think that I have a smart head, and don't I realize how important these hearings are? I assure you I do, and that is why I'm speaking this evening. You see, I say this because my dad just passed away. He was just shy of his 77th birthday at the end of this month. I've spoken about my dad over the years at these hearings, told you that he built the buildings years ago. It was an extremely difficult process, and there was not an abundance of money, but rather an abundance of his talent and drive. I told you that ETPA laws were enacted around us, and that despite everything that was thrown his way, my dad saw it through to completion and finished the buildings. That's where I come in. As I said, I manage the buildings my dad built. In today's day and age, management of these buildings has proven difficult, stressful, and at times I questioned if I could do it. I would ask this board to realize how COVID-19 has been and the impact it's had on the smaller landlords. The added expenses to make sure we are properly cleaning and disinfecting the buildings multiple times a day. The added cost to get the supplies, finding the supplies. The increase in our heating and water bills as many of our tenants were home 24/7 due to the mandates. The struggle between maintaining the balance of taking care of service requests and keeping the proper social distance to ensure everyone's safety was hard. This was new territory for all of us. All of this is on top of the smaller landlords' constant struggle with the day-to-day management of our buildings. We are always operating on a tight budget. Often we are our own bookkeepers, rental agents, and secretaries. We perform the basic upkeep of our properties. Whatever job that needs to be done to maintain the buildings, we do ourselves. And more often than not, we cannot afford to hire an outside managing agent, as there's simply not enough money in the budget. Please note that the smaller landlords like myself and the majority of members of the AOAC and WOA are the type of landlords this industry needs, not the absentee landlords most tenants at these hearings testify about. We care about our tenants, we are hands-on, and we do not have buildings that are riddled with violations and problems. We are also the landlords that take a direct hit when this board passes ridiculously low and unjustifiable rent guidelines. So I'm here tonight on behalf of my dad. and to remind this board that the smaller landlord is constantly struggling to make ends meet while all the while making sure our tenants receive good service. To remind this board that this struggle is exhausting and having to work under such financial pressures that are created not by my action, but rather further exacerbated by the passing of a low rent guidelines will break me.
3 minutes.
I will not be able to sustain and maintain the buildings if you continue to pass low rent guidelines. Thank you for your time. Stay safe, be well.
Thank you, and we're very sorry about the passing of your father. Our
Thank you.
condolences.
Thank you.
If anybody in the board has a question?
Did you say you had one building,
No, I have 3 buildings.
3 buildings?
Yes.
Okay, in the same area?
Yonkers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Evelyn?
No, that was my question.
Oh, okay.
Where the apartment's located? Yeah, that's fine.
Belen, you want to go next?
No, I'm good.
Oh, you
That's
don't have a
my
question?
Yeah, she
Ken
answered.
Finger, you have to unmute. Unmute your,
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
on mute. Thank you.
great.
My wife is on the other phone. Ms. Chiafatelli, thank you for your testimony. Can you tell me whether or not your rents, you have any particularly low rents in your buildings, or what is the average rent that you might have?
Yes, I do. I do have low rents in the buildings. We have 2 bedrooms that rent $775, $1,200 when the market is $1,995 at the moment. As well as I have 1 bedrooms that rent high 600s, and the markets for those are $1,650. About probably 35% of my apartments have low rents.
Yes, Evelyn.
You mentioned that there's additional costs associated with COVID disinfection. Could you estimate approximately what those costs are monthly per building?
No, because I'm still processing the bills. We had a really hard time getting supplies, which I'm sure, like, for you guys not to be able to get wipes and whatnot, for the average person is okay. But for a landlord, we needed bleach, we needed supplies, and the bills just keep coming. We ordered it, and honestly, the costs were 10 times the amount of what they should have been. I don't have all the bills in yet, but I easily paid 10 times more than what I should have paid. And we're still paying because we're still in a pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
I will try to call people, but we only have 5 tenants testifying, so I'm gonna call 2 landlord representatives and then 1 tenant representative. At this point, I will call Chris DePail.
Who?
Is he available?
There's somebody named Chris on here, so I'll promote them and see if that's.
Is that the Chris? Is that the Chris DeFeo spoke the other night?
Yes, same person.
I spoke to him before. He said he was up in Rhode Island and didn't have the ability to get in.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to call Lisa DeRosa. And please, is she available, Peter?
Yes.
Last 6 months would look like for our communities. This pandemic has brought my vacancy rate to well over 5%.
Ms. DeRosa, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Ms. DeRosa, can you tell us if you're representing any an organization or you are here as an individual?
I'm here as an individual.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Lisa DeRosa, and 56 years ago, my father built the buildings we now manage. I don't think he had any idea of what the future would hold when he started out, and I don't think anyone could foresee what the past 6 months would look like for our communities. This pandemic has brought up my vacancy rate to well over 5%. As young adults were leaving their apartments due to school cancellations or to go home to their families in other states, landlords saw increased costs coupled with decreased income. During this time, our heating and water costs have seen upsurges due to increased usage from people staying home. Our costs for purchasing necessary protective equipment and cleaning supplies for our staff members were exacerbated by people gouging in the market, forcing us to pay exorbitant prices for basic and usually inexpensive items. Building staff work long hours to repeatedly sanitize buildings for the health and safety of our tenants, while non-essential repairs are continuing to backlog. Finally, the additional enforced expense of outfitting administrative staff with computers, printers, and FedEx cost to keep an essential small business running during a pandemic. The flip side of this occasion that you don't hear about are the efforts landlords are making to work with their tenants. We have deferred the start date of rent increase struggling residents by financial burden. We have residents months behind in their rent who we are working with to make payment plans. We have parents calling from other states asking to break their child's lease so they can have it with them, and we have accommodated every request. I paid a member of my staff to reach out to any residents we deemed high risk due to their age, known health problems, or if they lived alone, to ensure they were safe and see if they needed anything. Once we cycled through those residents, we then called all tenants to check in on them. Keep in mind, we don't have 12 units, we have over 400. The reality is I create housing and jobs, and when you hurt property owners with increases not in line with their expenses, you are also hurting the very people you are set out to protect, the tenants.
Great timing.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Mr. Rosa?
Mr. Rosa, I have a question.
Yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Rosa. This is Ken Finger. Do you have, what percentage of tenants do you think you're working with that have not paid 100% of the rent? And about what percentage do you think you've actually lost during this period of time until you can re-rent?
Well, we're still renting apartments that were available for rent in February, and we're going into July. I've probably lost 5% of my tenants who left.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, Elliot?
But it's not really a question. Somebody has a TV on in the background or something, and I know it's not me. So it would be very helpful if that person could either mute yourself, because it is it's annoying, obviously, interfering with listening to the testimony. Thank you.
So anybody else has a question for Ms. DeRosa?
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, Belen.
Yeah, where are your buildings located?
In
Not sure
White-
if I heard.
In White
White
Plains,
Plains? All in White Plains, 400 units.
yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes, Evelyn.
It's not a question, it's more of a comment, because Mr. Rosa mentioned that she and her staff made an effort to check in on tenants. So I really think that's very admirable, and I wanted to thank you for doing that.
Thank you for saying that. And just so you know, I wasn't the only landlord who did that. It came up in conversation when we had our own Zoom meetings that other landlords were doing it as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. DeRosa.
Thank you.
So Peter, I think I'm ready to call Antoinette Rose,
Okay,
representing the tenants.
looks like she is on, so I'm promoting her right now.
Yes, somebody has a television in the background.
Mhm.
I can hear it now too.
It's not me.
Oh,
Okay, we should be able to see and hear Ms. Rose now.
I'm Antoinette Rose. Are you hearing me?
yes,
Yes.
we hear you. Miss Rose, are you representing an entity or you're here as an individual?
I'm representing 1199 SCIU Union.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Antoinette Rose, and I live at 40 East Sydney Avenue, Mount Vernon, New York. I am a healthcare professional for the Montefiore Hospital Network, and I am a delegate for 1199 SCIU, the largest healthcare union in the nation, which represents 450,000 healthcare workers in Westchester and the tri-state area. I am here tonight to ask you to give us a 0% increase for rent for Westchester rent stabilized tenants. As a union delegate, I have heard from dozens of our members over the past 4 months, and I want you to know that many of them are suffering and need your support. Our members are healthcare heroes fighting on the front line against COVID-19. Many of our members are working long days and hours in hospital, nursing homes, home cares, healthcare centers, and for healthcare providers, putting their life on the line to help save the life of our patients. Our members are juggling work, homeschooling their children, assisting elders and vulnerable family members, and managing their household, all while trying to keep themselves and their families healthy and safe. Now I'm going to share a few examples of what our members are going through. My first example is one of my coworkers, Ellis, that work in Montefiore Medical Center in the HIM department for over 22 years, who had lost his life due to going to work with the COVID-19. He left behind his wife and 2 kids, and now the wife is only have 1 income in the household. Now, during the COVID, there were laws that were passed. We have to still fight to even give him his pension because there was not enough laws on the books for a pandemic. So during our contract, there was no laws written in for a situation of a pandemic like what we're facing today. Hello?
Yes, we can still hear
Yes.
you.
Go ahead.
Okay, you still hearing me? Okay. Another one of my coworkers is Anne-Marie. She and her daughter work at St. Joseph Hospital. Both of them came down with the COVID-19. Now, they also have to be quarantined at home, also with her daughter and her grandkids. Still, even though she have asthma, which is the underlying condition comorbidity, the laws that were there for quarantine for 14 days, we have members that are still out. She's still out. She haven't been at work now for the past 3 months, and her doctor still is telling her that it true to her underlying condition, she still cannot be able to go back to work because now she's having heart issues due to the COVID-19. And there's we're still fighting because St. Joseph Hospital now still don't want to pay her while she's out, but that's something that the union is working with them with to still give her her pay. Another example is one of my co-worker, Corliss. Now, Corliss went to work and he works 2 jobs in a nursing home. One day he went to work because the new rules in the nursing home is that every day they go to work, they have to take a temperature. If your temperature is too high, they send you home and then they don't want to pay. Carlos also have a wife, which because there's homeschooling, he got sent home 3 days, and the other nursing home did not want to pay him because they said his temperature is too high. So also, though, these are the new issues that the union are facing with our members because of the COVID-19, and they still have to go to, we're still trying to get them to pay and still work out their income.
You have
Hello,
30
are you hearing me
seconds.
still?
Ms. Rose, you have
Yeah.
30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm just gonna give you my closing. In closing, I urge this board to provide our healthcare heroes with much needed relief from a rent increase in the next cycle. Many of our members and retirees are struggling to pay their rent before the coronavirus pandemic hit, and things have only gotten worse under the current circumstances. Please support tenants like me that are already paying 45% of our income in rent and who are in the fight of our life against a devastating unseen enemy. Please roll back rent on 1- and 2-year lease renewal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. Any questions for Ms. Rose?
Just a comment.
Yes. Yes, Evelyn,
I
you
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to, Ms. Rose, I just wanted to thank you and your members for the essential work that you do. It really is appreciated by the community.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ken?
Appreciate it.
Yes, I echo that feeling. But in addition, have your members applied for the unemployment insurance if they're laid off?
Well, unemployment because they're considered to be full-time workers. So there are stuff in place that we are working with, but some people are working with us, some are not working with us. And yes, there are unemployment, but because they're union workers, there are benefits that are supposed to be granted to them. So even though they're filled out for, what should I say? They have a plan. It's some of them are getting, when not unemployment, they can get
Disability.
disability. Absolutely. So
Right.
with the disability, because of the COVID and a lot of our managers and institutions, this is new for everyone. So even though the law was put out in the Health Act here for 14 days, it's not only 14 days. So they're saying they're only willing to pay them and give them the disabilities and so forth for 14 days. So then we had to have a meeting and then we worked out with them. But each case is different. Some members are staying out for a month, some is staying out. Some members are still in the hospital for 72 days. So each case is different and we're just learning and working with them to see how we're going to adjust each situation. The relief was good, and that, you know, the hospitals, they receive some monies from the federal leave and the federal government, but they're just because they released it, it's not all of the members there that are guaranteed this this pay. So some members get it and some didn't get it. And even though in the pandemic, we still have a nursing home that's laying off 22 of our members that we're asking them through to this situation, you know, can they just work with us and not laying them off? So we having people being laid off.
Well, if they laid off, my understanding, they have the right to the regular unemployment plus the $600 bonus, which comes out to almost $1,000 a week or more.
Yes, but this is what's supposed to happen. that's not how it is happening. And even though they got laid off, we also have in our contract, it is called job where it's go through displacement. So they're laying off some of our members, and under the displacement that's in our contract, some of them are not abiding by the displacement, so they can find work in another facilities, because a lot of the facilities are now not hiring through to the COVID-19.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of loophole that's within those laws that came down from the federal government, because you have to have a criteria, and not every situation meets those criteria.
Anybody else? Belen?
No, no, she's explained quite in detail the hardships that I'm hearing. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
Oh, Tamara, you wanted to ask her something?
Oh,
I just wanted to thank Antoinette for taking the time to speak on behalf of her members. I know that she's heard a lot of really sad stories and a lot of really difficult situations that people are in. And so thank you for taking the time to come and speak this evening.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you. Peter, I'm ready to call Jean Teresta. Is he available?
Yes, I'm going to promote him now. Mr. DeResta advised that he and his wife are going to be speaking off of the same computer, so it may make sense to call them in succession.
Okay. Are they here representing an organization or as individuals?
Should be able to hear him now.
Hello. Good evening.
Hello, Mr. DeResta.
Hello, Ms. Rubin. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm glad to see you healthy and happy. Are you here? Are you here representing yourself or an organization?
Myself.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes, and I understand your wife is going to follow you.
Yes, we have.
With 3 minutes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I will summarize a document which I have submitted to Mr. Finger and Mr. Shearson. It is complex, as you know. I'm a physicist, mathematician, so I will only have enough time to highlight it. In the past, I used to give it to the board so that at the very least you could review it. So that's going to make my presentation more difficult. Okay, so I'm going to start now. All right, so good evening, Madam Chairman and members of the 2020 Rent Guidelines Board. My statement will summarize findings from a financial analysis attached to the statement performed with summary data in the 2019 and 2020 DHCR income and expense file obtained from Mr. Finger. I will also present some comments on statistical sampling and comments made by Ms. Roche as part of her 2019 Rent Guidelines Board testimony. Point 1, financial analysis summary. My analysis has determined that the growth rate of cash flow as percent of income per unit has been declining for the past 4 years. The analysis is detailed. The summary numbers are that the observed growth rate for the cash flow has essentially stagnated, stalled, while if we factor in the inflation rate, the cash flow is actually been declining. This is for the time period 2016 to 2019. So on the other hand, repairs and maintenance and expenses, including depreciation, analyzed separately, are increasing at the rate of 2.68 and 2.67 over that same 4-year time period. Well, the numerical conclusions directly refute the frequent comments made by tenants and their advocates that property owners are making too much money. The numerical conclusions undeniably substantiate property owner testimony that low rent increases the past 4 years have reduced their cash flow while their expenses have been increasing. The rent guidelines must intervene to bring income and expenses more into balance. Now, with regard to the statistical sampling, Ms. Roche last year, in her testimony, which I obtained via a FOIL petition, claims that DHCR reports do not accurately represent the Westchester County income expense data because it doesn't include the entire surveys from the entire population. Certainly from a totals perspective, this is correct. However, when data is analyzed using average metrics, the values reflect the entire population and at a very high probability. Now, so let me explain that a little further. When a large population is analyzed for any parameter or test result, it is never possible or even feasible to sample all members of the population.
No, that's okay, Rena, but just forget it. I'll call Peter and tell him.
1 minute, Mr. Duresta. Eddie May, I would suggest that you mute your phone, I think she already did. Go ahead, I'm sorry, I'm gonna give you an extra time.
Okay, thank you. It is never possible or even feasible to sample all members of the population. Rather, statistical sample size power analysis performed to determine the minimum number of samples required to have confidence that the average metric value computed from sample data will reflect the entire population for that metric. From the 2019 and 2020 reports, it seems that 44.3 and 49% respectively of property owner populations were surveyed for the 2016 to 2019 period. This is a large percentage of any population, and the associated computed average metrics will, with high probability, reflect the entire population's value. Now, I want, in the interest of saving time, the statement that I object to was on page 1 of Ms. Roche's comment, in which she believes that numbers would be dramatically different. My extensive experience with statistics and sample size analysis refutes that completely. But since she opens the door, I offer some comments based on observations from the 9 annual Rent Guideline Board sessions I have attended and recent Westchester housing statistics obtained this year. Specifically, I've noticed that the tenants who give testimony all make statements that they have difficulty with their rent payments. I do not refute that. Figure 14 of the housing report breaks the tenant populations into 6 blocks. It concludes that 55.3% of the population must spend 30% or more of their income. However, tenants from the other blocks, which make up 44.7, a substantial block percentage, never give testimony because they are going to benefit from the testimony of the 53. So property owners, however, who give testimony are part of a significantly smaller population, and their testimony is reflective of 100% of the property owner population that own or manage apartments subject to rent guideline decisions. Within their buildings, tenants from all 6 blocks reside, and all tenants benefit from low rent increases at the expense of the property owner. Property owners must be afforded the same right to earn profits in line with other legitimate businesses. I will stop there.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Dureza? Yes, Ken.
I'm trying to unmute. Okay, can you hear me?
I hear you, Ken.
Okay. Mr. Duresta, what is your conclusion?
The conclusion is that for the past 4 years, unrelated in any way to the current pandemic, the cash flow is on a decline at a rate of about 1.1% per year, while repairs and maintenance and all expenses have been increasing during that same 4-year time period of approximately 2.7%. So there's a disconnect. Now, these calculations are attached to my statement, and I am more than happy to walk anybody through them. And the data is exclusively that provided to us by the 2019 and 2020 Rent Guidelines Board. Nothing has been concocted from any other source.
Have you submitted your written statement to the board?
I submitted it to you.
No,
And
you have
Mr.
to
Pearson.
submit it to the board.
No, I can. It would take me just seconds to do that. I can send it to Mr. Stecker.
Yeah, you can send it, Mr. DeResta, to either my personal email address,
He
Peter
said something
Stecker,
now.
or you can respond to the email that I sent with the instructions to
There was a
sign
lady
into the meeting. It's
who
probably the
was
easiest.
I don't,
I can first to the board.
Okay, well, it's easy for me to send it to you, and I'll do that after Ursula makes her presentation. I'll send it to you. But I did send it to Mr. Finger and Mr. Shearson, so that at least I was under the impression that they might have forwarded it, but I was mistaken.
Yeah, I would like to see it.
Absolutely, it's it's an open book. The analysis is very, very, very depressing, because for the past 4 years we are on a decline. We're on a decline. So and that is directly attributed to the low rent increases that we as landlords have been granted by the Rent Guidelines Board.
Elliot, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. You said low rent increases that have been granted by the board. Is that a misstatement, or?
Well,
I don't recall any of that happening. What?
The rent increases that were granted by the board were too low.
Oh, okay.
To even allow for a equalization of the cash flow to balance the expenses. The rates there's a disconnect.
So based upon your research, do you have a recommendation as to what would be for 2020, 21, what would be a fair increase for both the tenants and the landlords?
Okay. Using the model that I presented to the board last year, and which I used again this year, my analysis shows that a fair, not even what the industry standard is, but a fair increase would be 4.7% increase in rents.
Is that 1 year, 2 years? What are you referring to?
1 year.
And
1
what
year.
about a 2? 4.7 for 1. So let's round it off to 5. What would be for a 2?
My analysis doesn't look at that, since the majority of the leases seem to be 1 year.
Okay.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Lamont.
Does your analysis take into any data considering the level of wage increases, or the percentage of wage increases annually compared to the expenses of the owners and cash flow?
This model looks at, it's a simple model, and it looks entirely on industry profits over companies in the United States, about 7,000 companies, and it looks at what is the current profit margin that companies need and are using to survive. It incorporates the inflation rate, and on the basis of those numbers, I identify what would be a fair. Okay, and in this case, I'm using something like 5% less than the industry standard for realty across the United States, 5% less. And I'm saying, with that as an anticipated profit, what rent increase would a landlord need to get in order to basically balance expenses and increases? And that number comes out to 4.7%. It's just,
I understand. So you're basically you're looking at the cost of doing business, and you're looking at the market.
Yes, the cost of doing business, inflation. I have a more comprehensive model which looks at itemized expenses associated with heating, electricity, water, etc. But that is much too complicated to even begin to discuss. The tools that I use are standard financial engineering tools. And everything that I did is referenced in my spreadsheet so that anybody can go and look and duplicate my data without any problem. And I'm always available to discuss. I was a professor at NYU, so but I remain in close contact with my colleagues. And some of the data that I have comes from the Stern School of Business. So it's at the very highest level.
Just to be clear, you're not taking into consideration the consumer market factors like wage increases or percentage of wage increases annually.
No, sir. In this particular case, no. It looks at strictly a business. You know, it's like a balance sheet.
I understand.
It's like a balance sheet approach where you say, okay, you've got expenses, you've got income. In order for your business to sustain itself, you can't have a loss. You can't have a situation where your income is less than your expenses. Because if that happens, then the situation could lead to bankruptcy. It's very simple. You know, it's a very, very simple, but balance sheet approach.
I have a question. I missed
Yes,
something.
Ken.
Yeah, you said that what rent increase would be needed to get to balance expenses and something else. What was it? Expenses and
Income.
income. Okay.
Yeah, because right now we're 3.7, 3.8% discrepancy between how much you're making and how much you're spending. You're spending 2.7% more in terms of each year, and you're losing 1.1% in income.
Each year?
Yeah, each year. Using a discrete compound interest equation, the Fisher equation, these are all published standard equations. Using the DHCR data only, the numbers are there. It's very tragic from the perspective of the property owners. And if the desired effect was to reduce dramatically the income of property owners, Rent Guideline Board, you have succeeded. Time to reverse the trend and at least balance it out. We need to balance income and expenses. We can't tolerate losses without creating serious problems to our buildings.
Hi, Mr. DeResta, are you claiming that owners are not making a profit on their buildings?
No, I'm saying that their cash flow does not match their expenses and repairs and maintenance, the rates at which these are moving. We're making less each year and our expenses are going higher.
That sounds like the tenant side too, except that we don't have property. We just have stagnant wages and increasing expenses. So from that standpoint of things not balancing, I get where you're coming from.
No, I am not insensitive to the tenants, not at all. You know, I make the point in the statistics that the Rent Guidelines Board has traditionally been focused on, as it should, 55% is a large number of tenants of the tenant population. However, you've got 45% of tenants who are able to tolerate a rent. What I believe is needed is that landlords should be allowed to pass a reasonable increase to those tenants who can, and as we have in the past, make allowances for our tenants who are having difficulty. My building, which Ursula manages, has been in our family in Yonkers, Warburton Avenue, for over 50 years. We know our tenants, we know the neighborhood, and they know us. We take care of our tenants because we want to keep them and we want them to be happy. But it's a business. It's a business. You can't have hemorrhaging without consequences.
Thank you.
Shall I call
Oh,
Ursula?
Elliot, you have another question?
Yeah, one more question, Mr. DeResta. What changes have occurred since the passage of the new laws in June 2019? How has that affected your business? How has it affected the buildings?
I'm an engineer physicist. That question could be answered by Ursula, who's the property manager accountant.
Okay.
So please ask her that question.
Okay.
She knows that answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's not that I don't want to answer.
No, that's okay. I'm sure your wife will be more than adequate to answer that question.
Okay. Can I
Great.
get her?
Yeah, we will now hear from Ms. Ursula DeResta.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you
welcome,
all.
Ms. Ursula. Ms. DeResta.
Good evening, Ms. Rubin. Good evening, Madam Chairman and members of the 2020 Rent Guidelines Board. This statement will summarize findings of the simple forensic analysis of the net operating income percentage data component of the testimony submitted by Ms. Roach at the 2019 Rent Guidelines Board. We were in the audience when she gave her testimony. Net operating income percent is the principal metric she referenced to justify her position that property owners make large profits and are therefore undeserving of a reasonable rent increase. We submitted a New York State FOIL request and it was granted. They confirmed her metric system she is using is a net operating income percentage. However, Ms. Roach did not define the equation she used or how she referenced it. We attempted to determine how she arrived at a 38% net operating income for 2019. Our analysis concluded and an attachment to the methodology is used in the appendix, which we will pass over to you later. From its results, we believe Ms. Roach computes net operating income percentage by eliminating the interest expense as an operating expense from the DHCR's 2019 annual income and expense survey report. Therefore, this reduces the operating expenses and generates a higher net operating income figure. Her NOI value is not the metric reported by the DHCR or used by property managers, owners to evaluate their buildings. Rather, DHCR and property owners both use cash flow before depreciation and cash flow as a percent of income, metrics that are found on page 4 of the 2020 DHCR income expense report. Interest is a real and reoccurring expense covered by any property's rental income, and as such must be included as part of our annual RGB discussions to identify a fair annual rent increase. This is the justification used by the DHCR who prepare the annual reports. The mortgage payments property owners pay each month cannot be excluded because they rely on the net cash flow to make those payments. In addition, the DHCR members do not tell what the property owner's cash flow percentage really is because MCIs and IAIs are not reported as operating expenses on these reports. They are capitalized expenses that are depreciated over many years by the IRS. Therefore, in actuality, the cash flow reported within the 2019 DHCR report in many cases is really much lower. For many years now, property owners have put the profits back into our aging buildings and made many improvements. With the sweeping laws that passed last June, we will not be putting those funds back into the buildings for apartment improvements unless required. To preserve cash flow, only necessary maintenance costs are being expensed. If the Rent Guidelines Board does not grant property owners a reasonable rent increase, maybe some of the profits could go back into apartment improvements. That's it. You're muted, I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any questions for Mrs. DeResta? Elliot?
No,
Do you want to follow up on the question you made?
I think you mentioned in your presentation about the negative effects of the new
Yes.
laws and how again, how does it impact negatively on, not about you as a landlord, how does it affect the tenants negatively?
Well, all tenants want new improvements. You know, they want security cameras, they want other things in the building. I have to, you know, control the expenses now.
So those are things you would have done previous to.
Oh, without a doubt. And then I would, when a tenant leaves, vacates the apartment, I would improve him. Now I'm not gonna be doing that. I'll just be cleaning and doing the bare bones maintenance to get it to rent again.
When you say improvement, be specific, please. What would you do in the way of improvements?
Some of them I would do, I would just new floors, take out some of the wood moldings, get rid of the lead paint that underneath all the old windowsills, things of that nature. New doors, new hardware, things of that nature.
Appliances?
Oh, yes, yes. If they need it, yes. If they were very old, yes, I would replace them.
And now you don't do any of those things, is that correct?
I have not, no.
Thank you.
Only if necessary, then I do it.
Anybody else? Yes, Evelyn?
Yes, I wanted to ask, where do you own the units?
Warburton Avenue in Yonkers.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mrs. DeResta.
Thank you very much.
Peter, I will now like to call Delia Farquharson.
Okay,
Is she available?
yes, I'm going to promote her to a panelist right now. Ms. Farquharson?
Yes.
Okay, we can.
Welcome, Ms. Farquharson.
Thank you so much. Good evening.
Good evening. Can you tell me if you're here representing yourself or an entity?
I'm representing, I'm a city council member in Mount Vernon. So as such, I'm representing the constituents in my community who are renters.
Okay, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So good evening, Madam Chairperson and honorable board members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening on behalf of the many constituents in Mount Vernon who are impacted by your work. These are unprecedented times, and the impact of coronavirus in the city of Mount Vernon is both devastating and desperate. My sincere condolences to all the families that have been affected by this dreadful illness, and I'm sending strength, love, and support to all those who are still battling this pandemic. On November 12th, 1982, the City Council of the City of Mount Vernon passed a resolution requesting this honorable body, the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board, to impose a 5% rollback on rent, retroactive to January 1st, 1982. At that time, the resolution was expected to affect 100,000 tenants. The resolution documents that since 1974, the rent increases in Westchester County were disproportionate compared to surrounding areas. Please be reminded that Mount Vernon is the poorest city in the richest county in New York State. Then, and I absolutely agree today, the resolution said, and I quote, "Further rent increases would be unfair to tenants, and the only equitable alternative is for this body to provide for rollback of tenants by at least 5%. 38 years ago, the City Council of Mount Vernon identified that rent increases were burdensome to the tenants in Mount Vernon. That burden has only gotten worse. We have seen substantial and disproportionate increases in the cost of housing in Mount Vernon over these 38 years. We have seen significant decline in the quality of housing, a rise in slumlords and tenants forced to live in deplorable conditions with ever increasing rents. These conditions persist. According to information received from the city's planning department, 24%, almost a quarter of all our households in Mount Vernon are cost burdened and spend more than 30% of their income on housing. The survey revealed that renters spend significantly more on housing. And I heard one person referred to more than 40% just now. COVID-19 has revealed significant fissures in our social fabric. The need in Mount Vernon, all the need is significant. Mount Vernon has the highest unemployment rate in Westchester County. We are a primarily Black and brown community facing gentrification. As gentrification advances, families are being displaced from their homes and rent increase will only exacerbate the situation. I am conscious of the difficult economic situation many find themselves in at this time. We know that many in our city have lost their means of employment and find themselves in food distribution lines for the first time in their lives. Tenants cannot afford rent increases now. A prevailing narrative in our society today is systemic oppression. While police brutality is top of mind, oppression does not only refer to police brutality. Systemic oppression also refers to longtime residents being priced out of their homes and communities and being separated from the family, community, and culture they claim as their own. This too is a byproduct of systemic oppression. I implore this body to withhold any rent increases at this time. Please give our community members a moment to catch their collective breaths. While it is not your intention to displace community members, unfortunately, this will likely be the income of any rent increases. These are historic times, and historic times call for bold decision-making and courage to make unpopular decisions. I ask you to exercise compassion and delay any rent increases at this time. We are on the brink of a deluge of homelessness that must be stemmed. Pause for a moment and imagine how rent increases will impact that situation. Thank you very much. I cannot hear.
I turned my thing on. You hear me?
Thank you. Any question for the councilwoman?
Yes.
Ken,
Yes.
you go. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you for your comments. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the maximum amount of scree and dree allowable in Mount Vernon?
I am.
Okay, is Mount Vernon giving the maximum amount allowable?
We are. We passed that legislation last year, so we are giving the maximum.
Okay, and it took you until 2019 in Mount Vernon to get on with the program and give the maximum amount. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. I joined the city council in 2018, and that was one of the legislation that I championed.
Are there any other aspects of subsidies to tenants that Mount Vernon has passed that can assist the people that you are concerned about, both as to not only dree and scree, but as to those people who you say are rent challenged?
Such as what were you thinking of? No, we don't have. You know, there are no other programs right now that are available to our tenants. There are some tenants, of course, who are eligible for special programs, special housing programs, and those programs are being allowed.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Thank you. Evelyn?
Mr. Finger asked the question that I wanted to ask, but I also wanted to comment and say thank you for your compelling and impassioned testimony today on behalf of the Mount Vernon community. I was going to ask if there were additional relief programs that were available to Mount Vernon residents, which Mr. Finger already asked.
Right. I might just add that there may be some programs that are coming down as part of the CARES Act with the COVID relief, but I'm not familiar with those as of yet.
Thank you.
Hello?
Any
Thank
other
you.
question?
Hi. I just wanted to ask, when was the resolution adopted in reference to the work of our committee?
You mean the one I made reference to in my letter, sir?
Yes.
It was adopted November 12th, 1982.
Okay.
If you like, I can provide you a copy.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you could share that with our committee.
I will. I'll scan it in and send it in.
Our records.
Yes, Ken.
Yeah, are you familiar that at that point in time, the ETPA had actually expired in Mount Vernon for a period?
I know that, sir. Yes, I do.
Okay. And this was after they just right after they reinstituted it, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Evelyn?
Yes, it wasn't made clear, but you mentioned the 1982 request for a 5% rollback on rents. Did that in fact go through that year?
The city council did pass the resolution. I don't believe the board adopted the resolution.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Tamara.
I just wanted to thank City Councilwoman Farquharson for taking time out of her very demanding schedule. I know that our elected leaders have a lot on their plate these days in trying to deal with the pandemic and the various challenges that have been facing the community as a result of it. And I thank her so much for taking the time out and for being a consistent champion on behalf of tenants in Mount Vernon. So thank you very much for taking the time this evening, Councilwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you.
Thank
for your
you very much.
testimony.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Peter, I'm ready to call Tim Foley.
Okay.
Is he available?
Yes, I'm going to promote him. Let me just take this time there's one individual here who's there as an attendee. They're only listed as home. So if somebody could just write me an email on the side and let me know who that is, I'd really appreciate it. Or you can change your name in the in the Zoom as well. So I'm going to promote Mr. Foley.
Each stitch at the right hand is separate between the middle distal phalanges. Angle of shearing indicates a single shot.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Mr. Foley. Welcome. Can you tell us if you're representing yourself or an entity?
An entity, the Building and Realty Institute.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, members of the board. My name is Tim Foley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Building and Realty Institute of Westchester. Included within the BRI is the Apartment Owners Advisory Council, many of whose members you're hearing from tonight. Well, you've heard the numbers from 2019, and it's a familiar story. Every year, the regular costs go up. The major expenses continue to be property taxes, including county, school, and municipality, the cost of employing our staff, and repairs. Even when we see a dip in one area, like some fuel costs, we see an unanticipated spike elsewhere, like insurance costs. But particularly this year, looking behind at where we've been seems minor compared to what we're experiencing now and what lies ahead. It's a little bit like peering out an airplane at the mostly cloudy skies you've left behind, but not focusing on the cliff in front of you. That cliff's name for our apartment owners and landlords and property owners is COVID-19. Homes and apartments have always been our refuge, but they're more critical and essential than ever. They're now our offices, our schools, our childcare centers and playgrounds, our convalescent homes, and our bedrocks of safety and security all rolled into one. During this national health emergency paired with an economic catastrophe, it is imperative that they remain so. The burden of keeping our residents safe falls upon landlords and the essential managers, supers, cleaning, and other building staff that they employ. We had one of those building service workers from Local 32 BJ SEIU on the radio program that I produces, and he related what has become a very common experience. He said we had to completely change the way that we do our jobs. One of the first things we had to do was to educate ourselves about how to deal with the pandemic in order to protect our residents and our coworkers. For example, at work, we implemented a routine where we do disinfecting 3 times a day in high-touch areas. And then we clean the laundry room, gym, apartment doorknobs on a daily basis. And of the biggest challenges we have and are still having is getting PPEs and disinfecting supplies. And he concluded, I've been in this industry for over 26 years, and I faced many different challenges, but nothing like COVID-19. We're dealing with this pandemic every day, so we know that these are the things we need to do in order to save people's lives. And I know for a fact that the work we've been doing has saved many people's lives. Now, of course, all of that extra cleaning and extra protection comes with added cost for the landlord. When the pandemic first hit, cleaning supplies were difficult and therefore costly to find, as you've heard. Most landlords had to be creative to dramatically increase the work capacity for cleaning, disinfection, and security of common and high-touch areas, and to deal with a surge in deliveries and packages. Now, at first, many of our landlords were able to find this time by putting off non-emergency repairs, not as a cost-saving measure, but to protect the health of residents as well as workers, since there was simply no way to determine whether tenants were staying in their apartments because they were working from home in a preventative quarantine or had tested positive. The benefit of halting non-emergency repairs at the time was that that time could then be used on cleaning and disinfection. But as Westchester reopens and the list of repairs grows and the patience of our residents wear thin, we'll have to do more with less, or expand capacity with our hired staff, or pay for outside help and contractors over and above what we expected to do. Landlords and property owners are quite sensitive to the many economic challenges enveloping so many, including our tenants. And according to our internal survey, only 69% of residents were able to pay full rent in our buildings in April. Many of our landlords happily work with their most distressed residents on partial payment plans or other arrangements. Now, thankfully, May rebounded a bit. It was low, but it was still closer to normal in terms of collections, likely because of government programs like expanded unemployment insurance benefits. But that program only runs through July. And then what? Westchester has begun to reopen and people have started to come back to work, but public health experts continue to warn about a potential second wave in the fall with the second potential closure of the economy. And then what? Some local property tax payments have been postponed temporarily, but sales tax collections for those same local governments have cratered. So then what? And on and on. And even if we somehow weather the current moment, we have the full weight of the economic effects of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act bearing down on us even more next year. We've not faced a challenge like this before. And it's going to take every reasonable means of support to see us through. I urge you to weigh that heavily in your considerations and to adopt a reasonable rent increase this year, given the many challenges that we face and are expecting to face over the next year. Thank you.
Chair, you're muted right now.
Any questions for Mr. Fong? Yes, Elliot.
Thank you. Tim, thanks very much for your presentation. I think it was very informative. What would you recommend as a fair increase? I've asked this question before, you're probably listening. So what would you recommend as a fair guideline increase for both landlords and tenants? Not just landlords.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a little hesitant to adopt a number because I've not fully had the chance. Mr. DeResta gave a very interesting presentation, and I do want to look at his numbers and what leads him to a 4.7% conclusion. So anything that I would have suggested before, I would like to read the report first and see exactly where he wound up. But I certainly know that you've heard many of our landlords tonight. It's often the smallest landlords who are bearing the greatest burden. I certainly know that any attempt to have a zero or even a rollback, as some of the speakers have mentioned, would be detrimental, I truly believe, to many of our tenants. It would certainly be detrimental to many of these essential workers. Right now, we are, as a group, landlords have not been in a position where they've needed to lay anybody off out of recognition of how essential that work is. But everybody has breaking point in terms of balancing out the bottom line. So again, I don't want to necessarily propose a specific number just because I would like to look at Mr. DeResta's numbers again.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Foley. Oh, Tamara, yes.
Mr. Foley, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. You just made a statement that a rent freeze or a rent rollback would be detrimental to tenants. I'm assuming you mean because you're saying that if landlords don't get an increase, then they may have to lay off staff. I'm assuming that that's what you mean, as opposed to taking into account that you have people who have lost employment, who have lost income, who have increased COVID expenses, just like you have in their own personal lives, and that somehow they would be better off paying more money for rent that they don't have?
Well, I just want to harken back to what my original statement was. These people need their homes to be safe, clean, secure, reliable, particularly in this turbulent time, particularly with everything else that they may be facing. We as landlords would like to provide housing that is safe, clean, secure, stable, everything that they need in this oasis. At a certain point, that's going to require money. Now, we think there is a reasonable happy medium which would allow someone to continue being able to afford to live within their apartment that they're relying on right now, and to allow landlords to provide the services to keep it exactly the way that they need this in this crazy crisis time that we're currently in. And that's what we're suggesting.
Are you aware of any of your landlords that have applied for PPP and some of the other federal programs that have been made available to, businesses in order to help them through this difficult time?
For the most part, the PPP is specifically focused on payroll. That's the single biggest item that they're looking at. As mentioned, and as I'm sure you know from the review of the numbers that came through, payroll is a very large expense. It is certainly not the only expense. And you've heard tonight that there, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, there was quite a lot of price gouging with regard to supplies, particularly within cleaning supplies. And some of that continues until this day. Property taxes, of course, continue to be the major expense for landlords. We're not expecting that those go away. In fact, if anything, we're expecting that there will be a push to make up some of the difference in lost sales tax. So there are many, many different economic factors, of which payroll is certainly one, and we're grateful for the support of the federal government to allow us to continue to maintain these essential workers, but it is not the only expense, and it is certainly not the only expense that's increasing during a pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Foley.
Thank you.
Yes, Evelyn.
Mr. Foley, where are your buildings located?
Well, we have quite a number of members. They're primarily throughout Westchester County. We represent nearly all communities in terms of the Apartment Owners Advisory Council.
Okay. And you mentioned that I think you said 69% of tenants are having difficulty with rent payments.
Sorry, it's the opposite. Sorry, 69% were able to pay full rent.
Oh, okay.
roughly 5 to 7% were able to reach some sort of accommodation to get some support from their landlords. I believe Mr. Rosa and Ms. Giftella referenced some of their efforts in that respect. And then, so that's 69 plus, my math is not working that great tonight. That gets us to about 76%. So that would be about 24% who in the month of April were not able to pay anything. That number was greatly decreased in May as people started to see unemployment insurance, especially the expanded unemployment insurance, start to roll in.
So when the CARES Act expires and when the insurance plus expires, what do you foresee as the rate of possible evictions out of that 24%?
Well, right now, evictions are on hold. As you know, housing court is also on hold. And particularly, there's been an extension through August 20th for any evictions where the loss of income or the loss of employment is directly related to COVID-19. So we think that the CARES Act is supposed to expire in July. If it's not reauthorized, those people continue to be protected from evictions through August 20th at a minimum. I know that there has been some efforts within the legislature to extend that further. Of course, August 20th is itself an extension of what the governor's original executive order is. Things are changing month to month, so I wouldn't necessarily want to project.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Foley.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes, Ken?
No, I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. So, Peter, I want to suggest that we take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, sure. Whatever you'd like, Chair.
Yeah.
I'll just keep the Zoom running and, that's the only way to really do that, I guess.
Yeah, and then next week we'll call Mr. Jerry Holliam.
Saying to call him after the break?
Yes,
sure.
After the break.
Okay, so I'll get him set up a room and I'll set a timer for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, Peter, good, thanks.
Sure.
How many more speakers are there?
About 10.
Okay.
Just if the person who is named home, I've just allowed you to speak. If you could just speak up and clarify who you are so that I know who you are so I don't miss you on the list of speakers for tonight. Thank you. Or you can send me an email as well. Okay, if anyone can hear this, that's the 5-minute timer.
Peter, you wanted me to unmute?
Oh, is that you, Dennis?
Yes, yeah. I just
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure because it just comes up as home. So, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and mute you again.
Okay.
Thanks.
Testing, testing.
I can hear you, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Shh. What is that?
Is everybody back?
It looks like everyone's back. Yeah, Chair.
Belen is not there. Okay, Peter, the 5 minutes passed already?
Yeah, the 5 minutes passed.
Okay, I think we can resume. Welcome, Mr. Jerry Hollingham.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, members of the Rent Guidelines Board, and thank you, everybody, for your service. I'm Jerry Houlihan. I'm chairman of the AOAC, the Apartment Owners Advisory Council of Westchester County, and I'm a longtime employee of Houlihan Parnes. It's a family-owned real estate business specializing in the sales, leasing, financing, and management of multifamily properties. This year is the first year that we're coming out of the newly passed HSTPA law of 2019. And as you've heard from owners, it has been beyond difficult with the extra burden of COVID-19. There have been increased expenses in cleaning and disinfecting and dealing with more maintenance requests as tenants have been forced to stay in their homes for the past 90 to 120 days. We have also dealt with the income losses for our tenants. So as many have stated, we've been implementing rent payment plans, waiving late fees, and offering rent forbearance to help them cope with the effects of the pandemic. All of this we do voluntarily because we know the value that our tenants are to our businesses. They are our clients, so we serve them. The passage of HSTPA has been devastating to the operation of our buildings, especially as it relates to the major capital improvements and individual apartment renovations. One of our member owners testified the other night that the new law discourages renovations of apartments. I would say that it really eliminates it almost altogether. As another owner said, he plans on warehousing apartments if those apartments that become vacant have had rents significantly below the cost of operating it. The cost to operate an apartment, according to your DHCR tables this year, is $1,160 per month. With the new law, it really makes no sense to renovate an apartment and re-rent it. Here's why. In addition to the loss of the previous 20% vacancy increase, the individual apartment improvement rent increases are now limited to a monthly rent increase equal to 1/168th of the cost in a 35 unit or less building and 1/180th of the cost in larger unit buildings. The amount allowed for purposes of IAI increases is limited to $15,000 in any 15-year period and ends after 30 years. So if an owner spends $15,000 in a 40-unit building, they are entitled to an $83.33 increase in monthly rent. That means an apartment that vacated with a previous rent of $750 can only be rented for $833. So the net result is, instead of losing $410 per month, he is now losing $325 per month. So you can understand why an owner would choose the warehouse apartments with the hope that the state will come to its senses and revise the law eventually. It's also apparent that last year our legislators failed to address the housing affordability issue properly. The solution to affordable housing is not to restrict rents, but to partner with the real estate community in the smart building of housing through tax incentives, grants, and the removal of laws that prevent development. The more restrictions that are placed on rents, the more our ATPA regulated housing stock suffers. Most of our buildings are almost, if not 100 years old, and the vital systems that run these buildings, the plumbing, roofing, electrical, elevators, heating, and windows, have limited useful lives. They need to be replaced over time. This new law prevents that from happening now. Last year at our hearings, an owner testified that he had a capital expenditure budget to replace all the elevator systems in 5 of his properties. After the law passed in May, everything was canceled. With all of this said, we know that your duty as a board member is limited to lease renewal increases and that you have no control over the state housing laws. But in your deliberations, you must consider all of these negative effects that HSTPA has caused to the owners and their properties. To further burden them with minimal increases would ultimately make the ones that they serve, the tenants, suffer even more. If you look again at your HCR tables this year, there really isn't that much of a difference of the increases between the rental income and the operating expenses. They have increased 2.7% and 2.9% respectively from last year. If we did not get the increases, the 1.75% for 1 year and the 2.75% for 2 years last year, there would have been a much larger divide. Both owners and tenants deserve fair, reasonable increases this year. Please help our buildings and our apartments remain safe and livable. We thank you for your service to this board and for allowing me to speak tonight.
Thank you. Any question for Mr. Hollihan? Yes, Tamara.
Good evening, Mr. Houlihan. How are you?
Good, Tamara. How are you?
I'm okay. So what I want to ask is, I hear what you have to say about MCIs and IAIs, and I certainly have had some personal experience with those, particularly the MCIs in my building. As a matter of fact, recently we had elevators replaced in my building. Now, owners are still able to apply for MCI increases for that work. It's not as if they're expected to do it and not get compensated for it. Above and beyond that, I know as a tenant that the MCIs that are baked into current rents is profit that many owners have been, I guess maybe have gotten accustomed to, and so they no longer even consider it as such. But that from the tenant perspective, we've paid for some things. For instance, when I moved into my apartment in 2006, they just replaced the windows in the building. I've been paying for those windows since 2006. They also did individual apartment improvements in my apartment prior to my taking residence here. And it included 3 air conditioners that I could count the number of times I have turned on in the last 14 years. And yet I pay for them every single month, summer, winter, spring, and fall. And my landlord gets revenue from these, from some things, even though his costs have already been recovered. The fact that I don't use the air conditioners doesn't matter, that I still have to pay for them because he decided to put them in the building. So I've also recently received MCI paperwork for other buildings in my complex because I assist with the paperwork with that. So it's not as if landlords are no longer able to recover anything. But then again, I've seen situations where there are apartments where somebody lived there, they moved out, the next person moved in, they lived there for a year or 2 years, that person moved out, then somebody else came in and they were there for a fairly short tenancy, and every single time somebody moved out, the landlord went in, did individual apartment improvements, and jacked up the rent to the point where we've got $1,700 one-bedroom apartments in my building that most people cannot afford. Who, if they're paying that much money, they usually have a family, and a one-bedroom apartment is not sufficient space for them. But the old rules allowed that kind of abuse by some landlords. I'm not saying they all did it, but when it comes to MCIs, if they meet the criteria, I know for a fact that owners can still apply for them. So it's not as if owners are not able to get it, and they are still collecting for the MCIs that have been on the books for God knows how long. Can you help me understand how somehow it sounds like you're saying that owners are being deprived of the ability to apply for major capital improvement increases? That doesn't sound correct to me.
Well, what I'm saying is, and well, let me first address what you're saying is that the cost to implement those cap improvements, you're saying, is more for over time. And I would say to you that, you know, these improvements, these systems, vacancies, other things with which were maybe favoring the landlords, this new law now is completely dictating them.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. I don't know.
Yeah, I
if
think he's
So
freezing.
far the other side. Excuse me?
I couldn't hear anything you said. I don't know.
Your
if you-
video is freezing up. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, what I'm saying is that the new law has just not equalized this at all. It's just turned the other way around. I mean, the whole example I gave of an apartment renting for $750, where you can get an $80 increase when the cost to run it is $1,160 a month, is ridiculous. I'm not saying what you're saying is incorrect, but the new law is just, it's ridiculous. It has to be revised.
How many of those $750 a month apartments are there? Is that really the rule, or is that the exception? Because I've spoken to the property manager here at Westchester Plaza, and we have almost 700 apartment buildings in the complex, and
Right.
he's not seeing vacancies that are going, that people moving out and
Right.
having to warehouse because apartments are $750.
Well, the Chris DeFeo that testified the other night, you know, has 600-700 apartments in Mount Vernon and Yonkers, and he said 25 to 30% of them are below market, you know? So it may not be the case in your building, but there are plenty of cases.
Yes, Ken.
Good evening, Mr. Houlihan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Is it true that under the new HSTPA, the maximum amount you can increase the rent for a capital improvement is 2%?
Yes.
And if you collect that 2% for 30 years, that comes out to a maximum of 60% of the cost. And then what happens after 30 years?
After 30 years, you have to return it. You have to refund it.
You have
It's
to go
just,
back.
yeah, you have to go back.
To the rent.
Right. So the law is, it's just, there's so many things wrong with it. It has to be redone.
And you're expending on a major capital improvement for that 2% a year you get, you're laying out the full amount up front. Isn't that right?
That is correct, sir.
And in addition to that, you have to probably finance it. And as Mr. DeResta pointed out, the interest cost of that wasn't even included in the calculation last year, I believe.
That is correct too.
So you're spending over 30 years, you're getting back 60% at present day value. It's probably about 25%. And you're laying out all the money up front, plus interest, plus the capital cost for the 2%. And that is why people aren't doing the major capital improvements. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Holman.
Thank you, and thank everybody for your service.
Thank you. Peter? At this point, I'm ready to call Mr. Dennis Harrington.
Okay. Being promoted right now. Mr. Hanratty, if you could unmute your computer, please.
Is that all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome, Mr. Hanratty.
Well, thank you. Should I get started?
Are you representing yourself or an
No,
entity?
representing Mount Vernon United Tenants.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. Madam Chair and members of the board, my name is Dennis Hanratty, and I'm the Executive Director of Mount Vernon United Tenants. I'm making this presentation to call for a rent rollback, or at the very least, a rent freeze for both 1 and 2 year lease renewals. It is widely recognized that tenants are the most likely in Westchester to be low income and are the ones hardest hit in today's economic crisis. There is virtual consensus on this point in all reporting. What follows is a brief analysis from the June 15th to 22nd, 2020, The Nation magazine. Quote, "This should be a start from scratch moment. The pandemic is not just a health crisis. It has made clear what Nation readers already know. A tiny elite in the US siphons off the wealth while most people struggle from paycheck to paycheck. Since mid-March, America's billionaires have increased their combined net worth by $434 billion, even as nearly 40 million workers have lost their jobs and some 100,000 people have died from COVID-19. The dead are disproportionately Black, Latino, and Native. This isn't surprising. This is how tragedies go in America. As the Nation contributing writer Zoe Carpenter argues in this issue, quote, "While COVID-19 is novel, its impact on the community was predictable." With this crisis, working people can see the fragility and cruelty inherent in our system of healthcare, housing, and employment in the US. But it is up to the left to translate this collective outrage into the building blocks of a more just society. End of quotation. In the spirit of this building blocks of a more just society, as a small gesture, having the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board roll back or at a minimum freeze rents would be a fitting local statement. With so many tenants in Westchester paying increasing percentages of their income for rent, it makes no sense to provide any increases in rent. This is true before the coronavirus outbreak and the resultant economic crisis, and it is even more so now. At my organization, Mount Vernon United Tenants, we deal with the victims of unavoidable rent on a daily basis. As the only funded and staffed tenant association in Westchester, we've developed a strong reputation for assisting tenants in need. The great majority of our individual intakes are tenants facing eviction, and likewise, the great majority of that subset is because of an inability to pay ever-increasing monthly rental amounts. Many of our clients or members, et cetera, are paying 30%, 40%, even 50% more of their limited income for rent. All of those tenants are only one minor hardship, for example, sickness, injury, temporary loss of income, reduced hours at work, et cetera, from being hauled into court on a non-payment petition. With so many tenants in this already vulnerable position, it makes absolutely no public purpose sense to enlarge that number by granting additional unearned increases in rents to landlords who are doing quite well. Ms. Genevieve Roach will be providing actual data documenting this. My perspective in providing individual case management services to a large number of the tenants facing eviction, approximately 250 to 300 a year in tenant families, is the incredible fear and pain that is inflicted on tenants faced with the threat of losing their homes and becoming homeless. These are real people and not just numbers. It is mothers with dependent children. It is families who have lost an income earner through death or illness. It is a family on public assistance who may have had their benefits temporarily suspended. It is a family which is going through a marital breakup, or any of dozens and dozens of other circumstances that are regular parts of life. However, these circumstances can be devastating for tenant families who are already rent burdened. Why would we further burden those tenants with any increases in rents? No, we shouldn't. Please, board members, and especially to you public members, do the right thing and grant the relief that is so needed at this time. Let's break precedent. Let's really make a statement about rent affordability in Westchester. Let's roll back the rents. Tenants deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Anybody has a question? Evelyn?
Yes, I just wanted to know, Mr. Hanratty, what percentage of tenants that you deal with, or approximately what percentage are not able to pay their rent and will be negatively impacted when the CARES Act expires, whether it's in August or in December, as it has been suggested, it may occur if it's extended. What percentage are you seeing of tenants that are incapable of paying their rent?
Honestly, I don't know right now. Our office has not been functioning on a full-time basis, but we haven't been getting many calls because, as was mentioned previously by one of the landlord reps, the courts are closed through August 20th. I'm getting a few calls about people who are worried about that, but I think a lot is up in the air about what's going to happen, both on a statewide basis, but also whether the federal government's going to come through with any support on this stuff. So I think a lot of people, I think what's going to hit the fan towards the end of August. We'll have a better idea.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question, Mr. Hanratty. Yeah, do you, as far as evictions, do you see or foresee a wave of evictions coming,
Yes.
increasing?
Yeah, I'm really worried about that. Like I said, I think it's going to really start hitting right at the end of August when the courts open. I think we're going to get overloaded with people. Usually we stop about 150 evictions a year, my organization, through a variety of either judicial or administrative actions. But it's really been slow recently because the courts are closed. But starting at the end of August, I think we're going to get just overwhelmed. And we're already talking to legal services of the Hudson Valley and other actors about how we're going to strategize to deal with this kind of problem. It's going to be really, I think, going to be shocking when we get to that point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Ask a question.
Yes, Lamont.
Hey, Dennis, how are you?
Hey, Lamont.
Well, first I want to commend you for the work that you've been doing. I know personally of the work that you've been doing across the county, working with tenants in Yonkers and in other places.
We're the only funded and staffed tenants, so we do get calls from throughout the county for assistance, and we gladly provide that.
I know for a fact. You've even done work in my mother's building on Highland Avenue in Yonkers. My question to you is, do you know what the process will be once the moratorium on rent expires? Will tenants be liable to make payments for back rent? And if they don't, be eviction proceedings, or is it still undetermined what the process will be?
It's undetermined, but I mean, we're really fully prepared that a lot of tenants are going to be brought to court. And I think the courts are going to be overwhelmed in the last week or so of August and in the beginning of September. I think we're going to see a real dramatic increase in cases that are going to be flying into our office.
Yes, Tamara.
Hi, Dennis.
Hey, Tamara.
Dennis, we've heard a lot from landlords this time, as well as it's a regular thing at the rent guidelines hearings about all these, super duper low rent apartments that are just like, fire sale rates and stuff. I know it's anecdotal, but can you give us some sense out of the people that, you're seeing a lot of tenants who are living in different places and what people's rents are? I mean, how many tenants are you finding coming in your office that are paying $750 a month rent for a one-bedroom apartment?
Very, very few. The great majority are paying, well into the thousands, 1,500. I mean, we've got people spending $1,700 for one bedroom apartment, and especially it's worse off. I mean, it doesn't affect this board. People who live in private houses because they have no protections. And I go into some places in private houses where people are spending $2,000 for areas you wouldn't even let your animals live in because they have no protections. At least in rent stabilized apartments, even if, like you mentioned in your complex, how the rents have gotten so high, you can't find an apartment in your place for under $1,700, $1,800. That's how most of the places are. We see an occasional person here and there, that, a long-term tenant who may have a $750 rent, but they're very, very few and far between. One out of them, maybe every 30, 40 tenants I deal with is like that.
Thank you, Dennis.
Anybody else?
One of the things, specifically about the rent laws, the law that passed last year, we've heard a lot of complaints about that. All that really did was start to level out the playing field. I mean, the field has been so tilted against tenants for so long. That's how the rents have gotten up so high. I admit that I was overwhelmed and thankful for the law that was passed last year, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. But really all it did was start to level the playing field now. And I think you see the response from the landlord community, the real estate community.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Howard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Peter, I'm ready to call Giselle Mankey. Is she available?
She's not on, actually.
She's not on. What about Ken Nielsen?
Yes, he's on. I'll move him right now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Nielsen.
Okay.
Welcome, Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you.
Are you representing an organization or yourself?
I'm a member of the board of the Apartment Owners Advisory Council. But I've limited my presentation to 3 points.
Okay.
So the first, incidentally, I sent through our BRI office copies of my presentation that Peter was going to send to the board members. Have they received it?
We did.
Okay, because I want to, there's a chart that I want to be able to talk to. All right, so I want to talk about 3 things. One is who we are. Basically, the people that are here, and most of the landlords in Westchester, are not large corporate organizations. They're family businesses. We're hands-on. This is our livelihood. We're the ones who provide affordable housing. Landlords need sufficient income to maintain the buildings. All of these buildings that are rent regulated are old buildings. At least 2 of my buildings are over 100 years old. They have good bones and they're worth saving, but they need investment, constant investment. You have to feed it constantly. I'm not going to get into problems with the HSTPA, except in one area a little later. But in terms of what we are, the people, for instance, that work for me and work in the buildings, these are essential workers. They've been in there disinfecting the buildings through this whole COVID period. We didn't lay anybody off. We kept them instead of, renovating, repairing things. They were out cleaning. And I think they don't get a lot of appreciation for the work that they've done keeping things going. One of the other things that came up before, I want to make clear, is that the landlords are not part of the CARES Act when they were providing potentially forgivable loans to small business. It doesn't apply to landlords. Landlords were specifically excluded from that. So landlords don't have that option of applying for it. It has to do with the way the law was written. So that's who we are. But my most important thing I want to talk about is the guideline increases that have not kept up with inflation. One of the things people were talking about, various things that are nice to talk about, but they're not specifically in the law. As you know, you've been on the board long enough. Your job is to execute the law that's written having to do with the rent guidelines. And the rent guidelines has specific things that are mentioned that should be taken into consideration. And one of them is the consumer price index. So on the chart that I submitted, I compared for the last 10 years, the consumer price index, the cumulative price index, and I compared that to the guideline increase for the 1 year and the 2-year leases that you have been giving for the last 10 years. What it shows is that the guideline increases that have been granted by this board over the last 10 years have fallen short of the consumer price index. On a cumulative basis, the 1-year guidelines are 11.2% less than the CPI, and the 2-year guidelines are 41.3% less than the consumer price index. That's why you have situations with people who live in apartments for 30 and 40 years, why they end up with $700 apartment rents, because they've taken 2-year leases and the rent falls, back, behind the consumer price index. If you look at, you can see that the gap in the table on the chart. The highest line is for the consumer price index for all urban consumers. The next one down is the 1 year, and the one in the bottom is the 2-year guideline. If you're looking at if the CPI is at 2.5%, the 2-year lease should be, for a 2-year period, should be 5%, and usually it's not. So in the past, sometimes the reason why things have balanced out reasonably well is that it was made up by the vacancies. You were able to catch up from those apartments that have been basically subsidized for all the years when they become vacant. Well, with the new HSTPA and their formulas, that's not possible anymore. So the only way rents are going to increase is by the guidelines. So I think it's more of it falls on the guidelines that you guys are setting. The last point I want, third point, is that the HSTPA has increased management costs. The notice requirements that are in the law mandated by the HSTPA have resulted in higher management costs. This is reflected in the tables. The cost increased by 4.2% from 2018, 2019. Our legal fees have gone up, and the staff time required to send out multiple notices takes time, costs money. So the HSTPA mandated this. Now the guidelines board, has mandated this, and it requires additional costs. The guidelines board has to take that into account when they're setting the guidelines. one final thing, I just got the tax bill for Yonkers. My properties are all in Yonkers. And it went up by 2.5% for the coming year. I know the representative from the councilwoman from Mount Vernon was talking about zero guidelines or rollbacks, but taxes never, they're the ones who set the taxes, our biggest single cost, but that never gets rolled back. That never goes down. It always goes up. And it's our largest single cost. So it always bothers me when these politicians come in and say roll back, but they can't control their own costs.
Mr.
Anyway,
Nielsen,
yes.
your time is up. Can
Okay,
you wrap up, please?
I'm finished. I could go on, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, anybody has any questions? Yes, Tamar.
Hi, Mr. Nelson.
Hi, Ms. Stewart.
My question for you is, do you have any suggestion for how tenants whose incomes are not keeping up with CPI either, how we're supposed to pay 5% increases when our salaries are essentially flat?
Yeah, the reality is that in some cases they haven't. I know I have tenants that are on Section 8 and that gets adjusted. I have tenants that are on various other programs that adjust to carry it so that they only are able, it's only necessary for them to pay 30% of their gross income for their rent. The fact is that some people are going to fall behind, and we as a society have a responsibility to help those people, but you just can't lay it all on landlords because we have costs. What that shows is that our costs keep going up, and you can't just say, oh, we'll take a little bit more out of the landlords every year. But then they say, we also want you to maintain the buildings at a standard that we and our tenants find acceptable. But that's not dealing with a full deck. The fact is that it costs real money to do a lot of this stuff. It is a dilemma that we as a society have to deal with, but sticking it on the landlord is not realistic.
Are you making
Yes.
a profit, Mr. Nielsen?
Huh?
Are you making a profit, Mr. Nielsen?
Yes, we are. We are making a profit. I've been in the business for a long time, for over 35 years. And in some cases, we've been able to pay off our mortgage. And that's allowed us to operate profitably. But for people who have, recently bought buildings, have big mortgages, I don't know how they make it.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen.
Yes, Ken.
Yes.
Ken, you have to unmute.
Huh? I have to unmute?
No, the other Ken Finger.
Okay.
I said, he has a question for you.
All right.
My apologies. So is what you're saying to us, in other words, that it is society or the local community's problem to assist the tenants and maybe even the landlords, and not have the landlords bear the full cost of the society's problem, whether it be the pandemic or the inability to pay rent or paying more than 30%? Do you think that they should, for example, require that every community give the maximum scree and dree, which we heard tonight Mount Vernon finally got in last year? I don't know if Yonkers does or New Rochelle or White Plains, but might that be one way to handle rent challenge tenants, or put additional money in for Section 8 and expand that and other programs? Would you recommend that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have some tenants that are on scree programs, and you know, it's a hassle in terms of the paperwork, but you know, they're long-term tenants, and you know, I have no problem with them taking whatever they can get from the government to help them to stay in their apartments. One of the things that I want to emphasize also before I forget is the idea that we're talking about items that are in the law that we should be dealing with. And I hope at some point, especially for the newer members of the board, that maybe the DHCR representative go through the list of things that they're supposed to be concerned with and what's in it and what's not in it. Because a lot of the things that were brought up today are not in the law. Their responsibility on the board is to execute the law, not to bring other things in that are not necessarily in the law.
For example?
For example, income, salary income for tenants is not specifically mentioned in the law.
Correct. Anybody else? Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Nielsen.
Okay, you're welcome.
Peter, I'm ready to welcome Mr. Matt Persanis.
Promoting him to a panelist now.
And after that, I will welcome Miss Genevieve Roche.
Elsa, how many more witnesses are there?
Excuse me?
I'm just curious, how many more witnesses are there?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Persanis, you should be able to hear us
Do we need
now.
another break?
Please not now. I'm so close.
Okay.
I'm okay.
Thank you.
I need more light in here because it's getting dark. Welcome, Mr. Persanis. Are you
Thank you.
representing yourself or an organization?
I'm representing the Building Realty Institute. I am their labor counsel.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. So my presentation is rather straightforward. I'm going to speak
You're breaking up, Mr.
about
Persanis.
the increased cost to land. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to speak about the increased cost for labor in the buildings. And this is due to the collective bargaining agreement that the BRI has with Local 32BJ. That collective bargaining agreement represents approximately 82% of the buildings in Westchester County and approximately 90% of the workers in Westchester County. So it's fairly representative of what's out there. Just so you know, the wages for all employees in buildings in Westchester County went up 3.1% on October 1st of 2019, and they will go up 3% on October 1 of 2020. The health coverage, which is 100% funded by the employers, went up 3.6% on January 1, and on January 1 of 2021, it will go up an additional 3.7%. The pension program, which until last week was in the red district, which means it was underfunded, went up on January 1, 6.9%, and on January 1 of 2021, it will go up an additional 7%. Overall, there is a 3.2% per year increase for all employees. That is my presentation. Thank you.
How much was that increase overall?
3.2% per year. And that is non-negotiable since it's already been negotiated and is good until 2022.
Anybody else?
I may need to join 32BJ. I'm only in CSEA and we're not getting 3.2%.
They got to do a better job.
Get a new union.
Indeed.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Persanis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
Peter, I'm ready to call Ms. Genevieve Roche. Is she
Okay.
available?
She is. I'm asking her to unmute right now. Ms. Roach?
Yes.
All right, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. My testimony is very abbreviated, but there is a wealth of very current research from May and June that is contained in my submitted written statement and handouts, which also provides sources for all the statements contained in my testimony. Moving quickly, I'll start with the pre-pandemic stats, which show that no rent increase is warranted or justified. Beginning with net operating income, which is handout 1. Based on a DHCR provided document, the owner surveys show that NOI for 2019 is at a robust 38%, even with the number of rent stabilized units down 6.9% to approximately 27,000 units. This is the 4th year in a row that NOI has been this high, with a 4-year average of 38.3%. And with the last few years' rates also being higher than those passed by other counties. Even the effective HSTPA in the second half of 2019 has not dampened the level of profits recouped by owners. Moving on to expenses and home heating oil, handout number 2. While it's net operating income, profits after expenses, that is the more relevant indicia, it's particularly noteworthy this year that oil prices have plummeted to less than half the prices of 2008 and are in the range of prices from 15 years ago. Prices are not expected to rise much from the current levels over the next year. With respect to seniors, handout number 4, with consumer prices having the biggest decline since the Great Recession, forecasts are that there will be no Social Security COLA for 2021, and if there is deflation, that could also affect 2022 COLA as well. Moving on to Westchester's severe lack of affordable housing and its housing wage, which is handout number 5. Even pre-pandemic, Westchester County suffered from dire housing instability, with nearly 1/3 of Westchester renters considered severely rent burdened, that is, paying more than 50% of income on housing. 1/5 are rent stabilized, and 36% of ELI income households are seniors. With respect to Westchester housing wages, fair market value rent for a 1-bedroom is $14.63 a month, 2-bedroom $17.75 a month, the latter translating to a housing wage of $34 an hour or $71,000 a year, decidedly out of reach for those with average renter income and impossible for minimum wage earners and households earning less than 30% of area median income of approximately $36,000. You will also note in the first page of the handout that per DHCR data, the average rent stabilized rent is now $15.12 a month, which requires a household income of more than $60,000. More telling, the average renewal rents on stabilized units last year were $17.86 for 2-year renewals and $19.83 for 1-year renewals, requiring respective incomes of more than $71,000 and $79,000 to be deemed affordable. What this means is that renewed stabilized rents are at fair market value. Yet another reason that no rent guideline increase is warranted, justified, or needed this year based on the owner survey data. Moving now to the impact on renters of the current pandemic and economic crises, which is handouts number 6 and handout number 3. With respect to unemployment, which is handout number 3, I'm going to leave the details to my written statement, except to say that in New Rochelle, Mount Vernon, and Yonkers, where 78% of all rent stabilized tenants reside, the April unemployment rates were even higher than Westchester's 14.3%, with April rates at 14.9, 17.1, and 18.6. With these high unemployment rates, And with more permanent layoffs coming, even as the county begins to open, with private sector jobs already plummeting 25% in the county, and with government jobs affected next as tax revenues decline, the already dire unstable housing situation will worsen, affecting every one of us during the pandemic. What's not needed now is a rent increase. It's probably uncollectible anyway, but what is needed are billions in emergency government assistance. Per the CBO, quote, the 4 economic aid packages passed since March aren't enough to bring a full recovery to the labor market, which in the second quarter was projected to see the steepest deterioration since the 1930s. Jobs may start to gradually return in the third quarter, but according to the CBO, household employment is expected to remain below pre-pandemic levels through 2021. In just the last 3 days, these are the headlines. Federal Reserve predicts years of high unemployment. Federal Reserve says low-wage workers hit hardest. Economic plunge points to steep climb for recovery, not before 2022. The Federal Reserve is testifying before Congress this week about additional needed government assistance. But even before the growing public health and economic crises, the lack of affordable housing was forcing 70% of New York's extremely low-income households into severely rent-burdened status, putting them one financial shock away from housing instability. That financial shock is here. A data analysis released in April estimates that it is $100 billion that will be needed nationwide in emergency assistance for renters over the next 12 months. Indeed, some predict that without emergency assistance, homelessness could rise 45% in 1 year. Sheltering in place requires shelter. Small owners, like tenants, will need additional emergency government assistance. Large owners have access to capital markets, plus several federal programs already offering them billions in assistance, and that information is documented in my written statement.
Thank you, Ms. Rose.
I just have my concluding sentence, Elsa, if you don't, is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So in conclusion, this board must not needlessly add to the crisis, and it must freeze rents over the next 2 years. This is especially so irrespective of the pandemic, given the numbers compiled by the DHCR that show owners reaping 4 consecutive years of an excessive 38% net profit. A 5th unwarranted rent increase is not justified, nor quite frankly is it sensical or ethical, and it is unsafe for us all. I trust you will do the right thing and freeze rents, and we can revisit the situation next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. Any questions for Ms. Ross? Anybody? Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Dennis, I would like to call Howie Rabikoff, if he's available.
He is. I'm moving him in now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome. And are you representing yourself or an entity?
I'm representing myself and all people that are absolutely exhausted.
Including us.
I'm sure.
You have 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Howie Ravikoff. Here's my story. My family owns a 29-unit apartment building in the village of Portchester now for almost 40 years. We run a decent building. We care about our tenants. We're not a slumlord of New York City, nor a faceless investor group searching for the highest possible return. This is more pronounced today than ever before. As soon as the COVID-19 crisis hit, we shifted. We ramped up our cleaning and disinfecting protocols. We started a whole new regimen of communication. Our newsletter was written, vetted, printed, and hand-delivered every day. We guided our tenants to trustworthy sources like the CDC and the WHO. We steered them away from social media misinformation. We did what we could to teach our tenants about the science of the virus and how to stay safe. We gave them guidance on how to file for unemployment benefits. We started a telephone calling program and checked in with our tenants a total of 230 times thus far. We continue that program today. We include trivia, art projects, yoga lessons, all to do while we were quarantined. Now more than ever, it's clear that the relationship between landlord and tenant is a partnership. Please don't see this rent guideline process as landlord versus tenant. It never was landlord versus tenant, and I hope your decision will be void of such friction. Allow me to shift focus. Village of Portchester recently underwent a reevaluation. My tax assessment is going up 77%. I had a vacancy just as we went into quarantine. June 2019 rent laws have taken away the 20% vacancy allowance, and I'd like to renovate the kitchen floor and replace all of the tile. Instead, I'll change out a few cracked tiles that I know right well will crack again. I wish I could replace the hardwood floors, but I won't even refinish them. I didn't even replace the carpet that's been worn flat. It doesn't pay to do any of these things. Suez Water Westchester submitted to the Public Service Commission for massive price hikes, which if granted will be retroactive. Year 1, 2.7%, year 2, 5.7%, year 3, 5.1%, year 4, 6.6%. The water company is also asking for an inclining rate structure for commercial users. Yes, multifamily tenant buildings are commercial users. The more water we use, the higher the rate, beyond the increases I just mentioned. I have no control over how much water my tenants use. Does your rent go up when you use more water? This is a beautiful building. The tax assessor's office says it's worth $3.5 million. It doesn't make any money. If you had a multi-million-dollar investment that didn't perform, what would you do? Over the years, the guidelines haven't kept up with the world. Please don't let this year be another year when we fall further behind. One final thought. The board is yet again charged with finding the right balance. Tenants who are very likely employees, most if not all of my tenants are employees, have a job, and their employers have been paying into a system to protect them should they lose that job. Applying for unemployment insurance benefits and one would apply for unemployment insurance benefits and get a check for a portion of those lost wages. During this pandemic crisis, there were additional sources for employees. There's PUA money and PPP money, which has a direct line to employees' pockets. The landlord has no such system. Not a single program available to help assist a landlord during this time. And yet, all of the landlord's costs remain. Insurance, electric, gas, oil, elevator maintenance, water, sewer, cleaning, garbage bills, the latter, all of which have grown during the crisis. They're all still there. And above all, the state, the county, and the village, they're all counting on me to pay my tax bill. So as you make a guideline decision, final sentence, Madam Chairman, thank you. So as you make a guideline decision and think about the pandemic and the economic catastrophe that's resulted, please don't forget this imbalance. Please do not forget the landlord.
Thank you for your presentation. May I ask you something? How many employees do you have?
We have 3 field employees, and I have 2 office employees. The 2 office employees worked from home during the pandemic, and I remained in the office the entire time.
And you were not eligible for a PPP loan?
As a landlord, no. I'm describing to you employees from our managing company that handles more than just this ETPA rent regulated building.
Elliot or Ken, do you know anything about this? Because my understanding is that the PPP loan is for any employer who has under 500 employees.
No, that's not true. Hold on.
Beyond that, ma'am, I kept all my employees working. They worked longer days and longer hours than ever before. We needed to maintain our property. We were considered essential workers. I didn't lay them off. I didn't furlough them. Their days weren't reduced. Their hours weren't reduced.
Yes, Ken, what would you say?
Well, I'm not sure about apartments. I know that cooperatives are not included in the PPP program, but I'll certainly find out about apartment houses. I didn't think they were, but I'll double check.
think it's landlords are excluded. What you may be thinking about or referring to as management companies. Now, that's independent management companies that manage buildings, for, of course, for landlords. Mr. Rabikoff is the actual owner, maybe with his family, of the building. So therefore, he's not eligible for PPP. Douglas Elliman and, just these big management companies.
No, that's not my understanding. I understand that anybody, even if a freelancer, a part-time employee, anybody who
They were
pays,
excluded. There were
no,
certain exclusions, and that's one of them. Landlords are one of the exclusions.
no, I have clients, I know, because I have clients that I have applied for the PP loan for them, and they are not, they're small companies.
Yeah, but they're landlords.
They're landlords of management companies.
Landlords and cooperatives are specifically excluded. We've been trying to get them in it, and they tried to put them in the renewal of it through October, December, whenever, and I don't think they were included.
Yeah, they were kept out.
Specifically, that the actual building owner is not included. As Elliot says, the management company might be, suppliers might be, but not the owner of real property.
So if I may, the landlord, I wear two hats. As landlord, I have no employees. I'm speaking to you tonight as landlord. My second hat is my managing company. During this entire pandemic crisis and continuing today, I've been able to maintain all of my staff. We haven't let anyone go. We haven't furloughed anyone. Days and hours are not reduced. I'm not able to apply for any program.
Not even as a manager?
What program would I be applying for?
Ms. Rubin, Elsa.
Yes.
In order to get the PPP, I have a law firm. It's a company. Unfortunately, we had to furlough most of the employees. They were not being paid. Therefore, you could get unemployment, etc. The PPP was a program designed so that we could pay those people who are not being paid.
Yeah, I know that.
That's right.
I know that.
What Mr. Rabikoff is saying, that he, and there were a lot of others, that despite the COVID economic situation, they were still able to pay their employees. And if they're paying their employees, then you can't get the PPP.
Ooh.
You can't unless...
No, I have clients that retain their employees and they apply for the loan. And as long as they never let them, they lay them off, they will still apply, get the loan. And if they still kept the payroll, they will the loan will be forgiven.
Right, but these are for people who are not working. I mean, they're not coming to an office. They're not actually doing work. The idea is to put money into the economy for people who could not work because of the economic situation. So therefore, the PPP put money into the pockets of employees that would have just been on unemployment, for example, which of course is pretty high these days. So unless, as Rabikoff, he did not lay, there are plenty of people I know, companies, they were fortunate enough, they didn't have to lay people off. They were able to pay them for whatever reasons. Now, so landlords, they have an income, and if enough tenants are paying the rent, then they may be able to pay the employees. It's a different situation. That's why you have to furlough the employees in order to get the PPP. That's
no, Elliot. I beg to differ with you. We kept our employees on and understood that for the period of time you get the PPP, we have to spend 75% of the money on the employees, that a salary that has now changed to 60%. And they've extended out the time, I believe, to October or something of that nature. But you have to, there's a formula that you have to achieve to keep them on. But we're not a landlord. We're a law firm. We got the money. We had the people on for 6 weeks before then, and kept them hired when we had no money coming in. And, but the landlords are different. I think you were right about that, that I think they're excluded. I know cooperatives, which are also housing housing entities, are excluded also and could not get the money. Even if some of our clients, for example, who are co-ops, were losing 30 and 40% of the rent and had to provide additional cleaning, sanitation, and other services, they couldn't get any PPP money. So I don't think you could furlough your people. I think you had to spend 75% on salary.
Oh, you had to
Well, that-
furlough
that-
them. Well, we
That
get-
seems unfair that the landlords were excluded.
No,
Well,
it's not fair.
whether it's fair or not, we have a government that one can question fairness about. I'm not going to get into politics, though.
No.
Landlords, that's not necessarily for management companies that maintain a payroll. So are you saying that management companies that maintain their payroll for their employees are not eligible for PPP?
Well, they are eligible.
Eligible.
The company that hires managing agents, property managers, accountants, accounts payable, accounts receivable, etc. Those, they have a company, but their clients are the landlords, the people
Right.
in the buildings. And they take a percentage of the rent, usually of the rent collections, that's their compensation. But they're independent of the ownership of the buildings. And Mr. Ravikoff is a small landlord. I'm speaking, hopefully I'm saying, not saying something that's incorrect, where he has not hired Douglas Elliman for some of these big management companies. You do it yourself, right? It's a family-owned business, and you have not decided to go to a management company which will take X% of the rents as their fee.
This building can't afford to do that, sir.
Most of the small landlords can't. You heard that from a number of witnesses, that the cost of paying an outside management company, usually between 3 and 6%, is that could be the profit, and they're self-managed. I'd like to just make one point, though, that there was a bill passed by the legislature called the Kavanaugh Bill. I'm not sure it was yet signed by the governor, which provides subsidies for those tenants in distress directly to make up for the lost rent. That's a bill that both the landlords and tenants can support, because it's direct money to the tenants or the landlords making up. I'm not sure how they do it, but it hasn't been funded, and it would have to be funded. But that's the answer. It's the government that ultimately is going to have to come in and deal with this, as they dealt with General Motors or Chase Manhattan or the big boys. They don't worry about the little guys.
Elsa? Yes, Tamara.
I was wondering if what you were talking about was the June 5th PPP Flexibility Act, because landlords are included. And I believe that Genevieve had a Wall Street Journal article documenting how landlords use their management companies to apply for PPP.
The management companies, exactly.
But that there are landlords who use their management companies to apply for PPP through the June 5th PPP Flexibility Act.
I don't know how you could do that. Because the management company is independent of the ownership. The ownership hires the management companies.
So for example, with the gentleman that's giving his testimony now, I'm understanding from what he said, that he's a landlord, but he also has a management entity that he also runs that employs people. So under my understanding is that his management staff would be eligible for PPE, if I'm not correct, unless I'm not correct.
He is the management staff.
I'm here today speaking to you as a landlord.
He manages the building himself.
But do you also have employees that work under you that help you manage the building?
The landlord does not. The managing agent does. During the crisis, the managing agent has had employees and continued to have employees that worked and were paid continually.
Okay, because based off of your testimony, I was under the impression that you said that you continued to keep the management staff paid at 100% and not an independent agency that was separate from your company or had no affiliation with your company aside from contract.
No, sir, there are two hats that I wear.
So you run both companies?
Yes.
Let me see if I can understand this clearly. You don't have employees yourself as a landlord?
Correct. The landlord does not have any employees.
Okay.
A management company that manages your buildings that you also have interest or are in ownership of does have employees that
That's correct.
Paying.
Okay.
And you've continued during this time.
Any other questions for Mr.?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Evelyn.
It's Eddie Mae.
It's Eddie Mae.
Oh,
Eddie Mae has it.
who has a
Did
question?
I
Evelyn. Evelyn goes first.
Thank you. So, Mr. Ravikoff, first of all, I wanted to thank you for providing services and to ensure the health and safety of your tenants. It sounds like you are a caring landlord. Thank you.
Thank you for the recognition, ma'am.
Okay, so I have a question for you. Based on the previous discussion, because you are a landlord and a managing agent, did you receive any of the PPP funds via the CARES Act in any of those roles?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Second question, what percentage of your tenants have had difficulty paying rent during this shelter-in-place order?
We have 29 total units. 3 tenants are having trouble paying their rent, one of which has come in and we've coordinated a payment plan that he believes he can execute.
Okay, thank you.
Eddie Mae, did you have a question?
Yes, I'll make this quick. Did I understand you to say that your rent, that your taxes are going up 77%?
Not quite, ma'am. Our assessment is going up 77%. The tax rate has yet to be decided, so I don't know my actual tax bill yet.
Oh, okay, thank you.
If you have any influence, please exert it. 77% is outrageous.
I know.
Any other question? Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ravikoff.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank everyone for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, I'm ready to call Bridget Rocha.
Okay, I'm gonna move her to.
Is she available?
Yeah, she's available. Yep.
And after her, I'm gonna call Michael McKee.
Okay, I'll make sure to get him queued up then. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, Ms. Roca?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ms. Roca, welcome.
Yes, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Are you representing yourself or an entity?
No, I'm representing the Rosa Builders, Inc. An entity.
Say that again, please.
I'm representing the Rosa Builders, an entity that I work for.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Brigitte Rocha, and I have worked for the Rosa Builders, Inc. for the past 18 years. I oversee the daily operation, including leasing and accounts receivable of 402 units in White Plains. Unfortunately, as many other businesses, we were negatively impacted by COVID-19. Our vacancy rate increased. We currently have a 5% vacancy rate. Many of our residents, such as college students whose parents reside out of state, canceled their leases because of health, safety concerns, the school closing, and the change to online classes. Leases were canceled with little to no notice, and to accommodate families that were going through hardships, we waived any cancellation fee. Lease terms were cut short 4 to 6 months, which impacted our monthly income. Due to the stay-at-home order and the closure of real estate offices, many of our vacant units remained vacant during the months of March, April, and May. In spite of the reopening of many businesses, our vacancies are still not slowed down. Some of our residents are still deciding to move out so they can move in with family members or relocate to other parts of the states. We are currently working with residents who lost their job and are actually having difficulties in receiving unemployment benefits because of the processing. We have residents that unfortunately have not paid April, May, and June's rent. July already looks grim. We lost income, but our expenses are increasing. We have people at home. Our expenses for heat, cooking gas, water have increased. We are kept all of our staff members on payroll. They are now working extra hours to clean common areas and keep our buildings safe and sanitized. Therefore, we are requesting fair rent percentage increase for ETPA units. And at a personal level, I would like to say that as an employee, when COVID-19 crisis came, I was worried about my employment situation and my health benefits. And my boss, Lisa DeRosa, made sure I was okay. This is my testimony, and thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Rocha. Any question for Ms. Rocha? Yes, Evelyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what percentage of your 402 tenants had difficulty paying rent?
I would say 20 of our residents. We have, and it depends. Some residents were delinquent for the month of April and May, were able to catch up in June. We have other residents are simply falling behind. We have been trying to help them. We know that those tenants were never late and we want to keep them with us. So we are offering payment deferral and recovery plans. I've been contacting them as much as I can. I've been trying to reassure them that we will try to help them because they were outstanding tenants in the past. And unfortunately, they were impacted by the crisis.
So that would be 20 out of the 402 or 20%?
No, it would be 20 to 25 units.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
But
yeah, I'd like to say something.
Yes,
also. Yes,
Belinda.
Yeah, so it's not a question, but it's just a suggestion for tenants who are having difficulty paying rent or might find themselves, with loss of income or interruption of income. Department of Social Services is actually a very good place, resource. For tenants to go. They might get assistance and they probably will get assistance for what's called one-time assistance or an emergency assistance for paying rent or rental arrears. So that's a resource that is. Yes.
Yes, Ms. Rocha.
We have directed our tenants to try to get unemployment benefits. We have directed them to Social Security. In it takes sometimes over 6 weeks for those tenants to get assistance without health crisis like the one we are going through right now. Sometimes it takes time for them to get the assistance, and they are required many documents before they get that assistance.
Yes, and that's on. Yes, I do understand that it is a government entity, so it will take time, but more than likely their rental payment it will be paid, and the landlord will be paid that rent, those arrears. So it's still, advisable that they do make use of that resource.
Anybody else? Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Rocha.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, you too. Thank you. Bye.
Peter, is Michael McKee ready?
Yeah, I'm just making sure that he unmutes right now. Mr. McKee?
Yes, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. McKee.
Good evening,
Welcome.
Ms. Rubin and other members of the board. I'm afraid somehow my camera got disabled this afternoon. So
Mr.
you can't
McKee?
see me.
Mr.
Yes.
McKee?
Yes.
Are you representing yourself or an entity?
I'm representing my organization, Tenants Political Action Committee.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the board, good evening. My name is Michael McKee. I'm the treasurer of the Tenants Political Action Committee. And I'm testifying on behalf of tenants. I'm specifically testifying that in this particular pandemic, it would just simply be very destructive and wrong of you to raise rents at all. And that at a minimum, you should do a 0 and 0. I think if you look at the cost to income ratio document that was distributed, just black out the first column, the one that includes interest and depreciation, because it's invalid methodology. And look at the second column. In 1987, net operating income of rent stabilized properties in Westchester County was 34.5%. In 2019, it was almost 38%. So over a 32-year period, basically landlords have been pretty much held harmless and have done very well. And you should also remember that it's not just the rent roll that gives landlords an advantage. There are many benefits that come from owning rental property, not the least of which is that you have a very valuable asset and one that increases in value over the years. I have to, as I have done in the past, although I haven't testified at the Westchester board for some years now, because normally at this time of year, I would be tied up in Albany trying to get stronger tenant laws passed, but because the legislature is not in session, you're lucky that you've got me, and I'm lucky to have you. But I have to take you to task for improper methodology, which is treating interest and depreciation, or treating interest at least, as an operating expense. It's simply bad economics. I've raised this issue many times in the past, as have others. Debt service is not an operating expense. It is a capital expense, and it should be excluded. So in order to do a real calculation, as Ms. Roach has done, you have to take out the entire line of interest, and that gives you a real number. So in dollar terms, in 2019, landlords had an annual net operating income of $6,504. And on a monthly basis, they had a net operating income of $542. Now that's an average. And that means some landlords are netting more and some are netting less. But it's nevertheless a picture of a very healthy, robust residential real estate rental industry. The earlier testimony about the consumer price index is just totally misleading. Your job has nothing to do with the consumer price index, simply because it's mentioned in the law. The CPI measures all items, food, energy, et cetera, not just rental housing costs. So it's irrelevant. Well, let me talk for a moment about the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. This was a major victory that we won last year, and it was a long time coming. As Dennis Hanratty explained earlier, essentially what it did was level the playing field. It undid a number of very damaging amendments to the laws that we have suffered over the last 25 years. But what didn't it do? It didn't re-regulate all of the apartments that we have lost to vacancy deregulation since vacancy deregulation went into effect in the suburbs in 1997. That leaves about 10,000, by my calculation, apartments in Westchester County that were formerly rent stabilized, basically without the tenants there have essentially no rent or eviction protections. In terms of the major capital improvements and the individual apartment improvements, the legislative staff that prepared the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act did an analysis, and they found that under the old law, the average rate of return for MCIs was 18%, and that under the new law, it would be 6%. Now, in other words, landlords can still improve their buildings, and it sort of offends me to hear them saying in so many words, we're not going to improve our buildings unless we can rent gouge our tenants. Because if you listen very carefully, that's essentially what they're saying. So I'm urging you to freeze rents. I think it would be immoral for you to raise rents in this current pandemic. The moratorium on evictions actually expires this coming Sunday, June 20th. There is a 2-month extension for some tenants. It's not clear from the governor's executive order extending the moratorium to August 20th exactly how this is going to work or who's going to be covered or who's going to make the decision. It's very badly drafted. I've talked to many attorneys who've tried to understand it, but for most tenants, the moratorium on eviction ends this Sunday, and the courts are starting to reopen. The New York City courts are reopening as of last week, and the administrative judge announced today that landlords can start filing new non-payment cases next Monday. Next Tuesday, next Monday, the 20th, 22nd. I'm not denying that landlords are feeling the effects of this extraordinary situation we are in. I'm simply pointing out that I think landlords are much better equipped to survive this current pandemic than tenants are. And I think you have to come down on the side of protecting tenants, which is essentially your job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. McKee? Tamara?
Hi, good evening, Michael.
Hi, Tamara. Tamara.
Would you, as you may have, hopefully you heard, there was quite a bit of discussion about programs that might help landlords and owners that, whether they are or they aren't, or what they're eligible for or not. Are you versed in that? Can you speak a little bit to what may be available to them?
Well, I only know what I've read, and Ms. Roach submitted a bunch of material to you about this, which I was very interested to read, and it was very helpful to me. First of all, there was a Wall Street Journal article about how landlords were not intended to receive PPP loans, and yet some of them did. I certainly think, Mr. Finger mentioned the Kavanaugh bill in Albany, which passed about 2 weeks ago. It only appropriates $100 million out, and that's money that comes to the state out of the CARES Act. And it's only if the governor agrees to use the money for that purpose. So in a sense, what the legislature did was to call Andrew Cuomo's bluff. We will see what Andrew does. But remember, it's only $100 million, which is not going to go very far. I volunteer on a tenant hotline 1 day a week. 4 or 5 months ago, the overwhelming number of calls were, how do I get my landlord to make repairs? Things like that. The last 3 months, the calls have all been about, I've lost my job, my roommate left, I'm now stuck paying the entire rent. I don't know what I'm going to do. My landlord won't let me break my lease. The law on breaking leases in New York State is very bad. And I think, we're going to see a tidal wave of eviction cases coming very shortly. I don't think it'll be waiting until August or September, as Dennis described. I think it'll be sooner.
You're muted.
Yes, Elliot.
Just a few comments, Michael, about some of the things you said I don't agree with. There is an unequivocal...
I'm so surprised, Elliot.
Well, okay, but I do respect you for what you do, and I certainly and can have a certain amount of knowledge about these things. There is an unequivocal eviction stay until August 20th, which may be extended as we get closer to it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Secondly, the courts are sort of reopening on Monday, the 22nd. And yes, cases can be filed, new cases. However, if you file a new case, let's say next week, the return date on that new case will be lucky to be in August or September, the first date. It is all going to be virtual. It is going to be very, very different than what was. Tenants have many more protections. There's not going to be any defaults whatsoever for the foreseeable future. People are not going to get evicted. It will be very hard to do so. Very hard.
Well, I agree with you that it's going to be a mess for the courts. It's going to be a pile up, and especially since it's not clear how tenants are going to, if they're going to have to go to court to answer, which would be unsafe. But eventually the piper's going to, eventually this is going to come down to the fact that people don't have the back rent. And there are going to be thousands of tenants who simply will not be able to pay. We are trying to get the governor and the state legislature to cancel rent as well as to cancel mortgages. We're getting a huge amount of pushback on that, and it raises a bunch of legal issues. But if government doesn't do something about making this up, there's going to be tens of thousands of evictions and people are going to be homeless. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And maybe it will take as long, maybe it will be the timetable that you're suggesting, but sooner or later, it's gonna happen.
We can agree to disagree.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. McKee.
Thank you, Ms. Rubin.
Thank you, Michael.
Peter, I'm ready to call the last two speakers of the night, Mr. Jason Scisiano and Mr. David Singer.
Okay. First one you mentioned, I'm unmuting right now.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yes. Welcome, Mr. Scisiano.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Are you representing yourself or an entity?
I'm representing the Building and Realty Institute. Levitt First is the insurance advisor to that organization.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to take less. You've been very patient this evening, all of you. Madam Chairperson and distinguished members of the board, good evening. I'm Jason Scisiano. Thank you for your attention under these unprecedented circumstances. I think you have a copy of my statement. I'll try to read it quickly. We are licensed insurance brokers with 51 years of experience located in Tarrytown, New York, and we're one of Westchester's largest brokers for the placement of real estate insurance. We represent many of the largest insurers and are the insurance advisors to the Building and Realty Institute and the Apartment Owners Advisory Council, who have asked me to comment this evening on the insurance market relative to these proceedings. As the DHCR reports show, insurance premiums are one of the top expenses for Westchester landlords. The cumulative one-year lease rent increases over the last 8 years have totaled 12.5%. Cumulative DHCR reported insurance premium increases during that same 8-year period were 41.7%. Insurance costs has outpaced rent increases by more than 3-1 ratio. But let's look closer at these numbers. This year's report validates exactly what I described last year when I stated that the liability insurance market was in a state of crisis. Now, crisis is a strong word, and I listen to dozens of speakers testify to this board every year, and perhaps you'll agree that hyperbole is not in short supply. But my use of the word crisis was at the very least accurate, and the current DHCR report is evidence. Insurance expense rose 10.2% last year alone. For perspective, it's taken the past 5 years of one-year rent increases to amass a total of 10%. Insurance went up by 10% in one single year. Now, here's the bad news. It's not over. Insurance expense will continue to rise in this current year. What's causing this unprecedented increase is a major landlord expense at a time when our economy has contracted, and understandably, when rent payments are being delayed. It's insurance claims. New York is arguably the most litigious state in the country, and social inflation is taking its toll on the industry. Thanks to the New York scaffold law, if a contractor fails to use his safety equipment and falls from a ladder, sustaining serious injuries, it's the landlord's fault. Case closed. But that injured worker's claim may have been settled despite no fault from the landlord a few years ago for $30,000 or maybe $300,000. Today, that claim settles for $3 million. You heard me right, $3 million. I had a building in Yonkers where a worker fell off the ladder, no fault of the landlord, and the claim payment was $3 million. Lots of lawsuits, big payouts. That's why insurance for Westchester landlords is, and will remain in crisis for the foreseeable future. But it's not just liability insurance. With the new laws discouraging landlord upgrades and improvements, apartment buildings will be getting older faster, resulting in more property claims, pipe breaks, resulting in water damage, electrical system malfunctions, resulting in fires, etc. These claims will in turn drive up property insurance premiums. In short, what the scaffold law has done to create a crisis for liability insurance, the new rent regulations will do to exacerbate the crisis on the property insurance side. Insufficient rent increases will add to the problem. No hyperbole here, just numbers and facts. I know this is a difficult time for Westchester ETPA tenants. These tenants continue to rely on landlords for safe and decent housing. It's a tough product for landlords to deliver when insurance expenses outpace rent increases by more than 3 to 1. Please consider a fair-minded rent increase that will help the landlords to provide a safe and decent housing that the tenants deserve and can take pride in calling home. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good timing. Anybody has a question? No?
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your presentation.
Have a good evening.
Have a good one. Peter, are we ready to greet Mr. David Singer?
Yes, I just moved him in, so I'm asking him to unmute now. And there you should be able to hear him. Yep.
Mr. Singer?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Thank you for waiting patiently.
It was a lot easier. It was a lot easier waiting in my family room than if I would have been in someplace meeting somewhere. So it was a lot easier. Thank you.
Are you representing yourself or an entity?
No, I'm here with I've been asked to testify for the Building Realtors Institute.
Okay, you have 5 minutes.
Hopefully I'm not going to need that. But basically, there's been a lot of talk tonight about expenses, so I don't have to really speak too much. I'm more of an impartial observer when it comes to the expense side of it. I'm here to talk about fuel prices and energy prices as it relates to the Westchester landlord. So to be brief, obviously, as was mentioned, the pandemic has driven energy prices down considerably, primarily because of transportation, travel, and leisure, and the decline in the economy. But what we are cautioning about, and what you'll even see in the Wall Street futures, is if in fact there is a recovery or some form of thaw out, phase 2, phase 3, there will be an uptick in consumption, and prices should resume to normal. So we just caution our clients not to spend that money. Don't expect this to be a long-term drop, it's really 100% pandemic related. And when hotels and airlines and travel and leisure industry as a whole starts to ramp back up to even 80%, it will impact energy costs significantly. So that's just my first word of caution. A lot of people, landlords shouldn't spend that savings if there is any, and tenants shouldn't, bank on that savings for themselves either. They should assume energy prices will resume to their normal levels, which are not as high as they've been in our history, but you're going to see pretty much a stabilized pricing to where it's been the last 3 years. So that's just the way it looks in the future. The second thing that's important to consider, which I've been asked to talk about, is the natural gas moratorium that is in place here in Westchester. And there was a big push for the last 10 to 15 years of landlords driving down their costs to help offset increased rents. And that run to natural gas, which was cheaper and is cheaper than heating oil, has been suspended indefinitely. So you're just not going to see that option for landlords in Westchester quite some time. So you're going to be seeing a lot more discussion about heating oil and the effect of heating oil and heating oil pricing. And in the third point that I wanted to bring out is we had a very mild winter, one of the most mild in the last 20 years. We always like to caution our clients to do their budgets on a 20-year average, which would increase consumption about 10% off of last year. So those are really the three factors that we want to just caution those of you that are considering these facts, is to understand that any dip in fuel prices is pandemic related and shouldn't be factored into any long-term projections. Natural gas is a much cheaper alternative to heating oil, but that price has stabilized and has really been pretty flat for the last 3 years with no real anticipation to go down. And you can't get any more of it now in Westchester. And the last piece of the information is Con Ed already put in and has their electricity increases set for the next 2 or 3 years, many of which are higher than normal to offset the shutdown of the Indian Head power plant. So you have a lot of factors in the short term. When I say short term in energy is 3 to 5 years, but you have a lot of headwinds against consumers, whether you own the house, own the building, rent it, energy costs are gonna have to go up in the short term, meaning the next 24 months, in order to just sustain the energy infrastructure. So that's really all I'm here to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singer. Any questions? Yes, Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Singer. This is Ken Finger. I have a question about the type of oil that's being used. Has there been legislation in Westchester that has required those that use oil to use a more expensive oil than in the past?
Yes, that's part of the discussion with the move to oil now as really the only alternative for landlords, is the fact that for all the right reasons, but there's 3 types of oil, number 2, 4, and 6. 4 and 6 were always a less refined but much less expensive product. And again, for all the right reasons, it's been mandated to use not only 2 oil but a low sulfur diesel fuel, which is pretty much the same stuff you'll put in a car. So it's fairly expensive, and it's really the only alternative right now out there that's clean and efficient.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, Tamara.
Hi, sir. Mr. Singer, I hear what you're saying about the oil and the pandemic, and you're relating the 2 things. But as I recall the news more, on a little longer time frame, the oil prices were going down even before the pandemic, because of what was happening with the Middle East and with, you know, oversupply, et cetera, and that was happening even before the pandemic began. Am I misremembering what was reported on the news?
No, no, you're not. I mean, when you're comparing it over the last, 20 years, absolutely, fuel oil, heating oil, gasoline, everything, all our energy in this country has been dropping, against inflation. Really, all I'm cautioning against, and really much smarter people than me, study these things, and Wall Street pretty much determines that. When you look at the futures markets, you're seeing very smart people kind of predict what they think the price is going to be a year from now or 2 years from now. And you're right, it's absolutely been lower than certainly when you and I were kids and waiting, it was ridiculous. It's a lot lower, but it's not, it's not free still, and it still represents about 15 to 20% between utility and oil of an operating budget of a building and a household for that matter, when you factor in the electricity as well. So it's down and we're happy, but it's not down to, all I'm suggesting is that it's current level. When you pull up to the gas station and you're under $3, don't spend that money. Hold on to it.
Thanks for the clarification.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Singer.
Okay, thank you all again.
If anybody has any comment, the members of the board has any comments or questions, or if not, then we will conclude this meeting. Before we do that, I would like to thank again the HCR staff for their excellent work. Peter, Toys, Harris, and all the rest of the staff who are involved in this incredible effort, and my colleagues, members of the board, for their patience and their enthusiasm and dedication, and also to the people who came here tonight to present, who took their time to let us know their testimony, which is very important to us. So with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Well, we're meeting tomorrow. Well, okay.
Yeah, adjourn this one. Second?
Second, now
So-
second.
We'll reconvene tomorrow.
Yes.
Same time.
Same
Okay.
bad time, same bad channel.
Get some rest, everybody.
All right, good night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Good
Have
night.
something to eat and go to sleep.
Go to sleep.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
And you handle that well, Madam
Thank you.
President.
Great job, Elsa. Great job.